Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is John O'Sullivan, and I'm the president of the Danube Institute, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you all here. I'd like to begin by welcoming in particular the representatives of the other institutions which have cooperated in creating this interesting and important conference, which is introducing to many people in this part of the world a very dramatic and exciting set of changes in world politics, originating, however, on the other side of the globe in Asia. I see the name of, the memory of Halford Mackinder is being revived in the world as a result of the changes since the end of the Cold War. His theory, published over a century ago, divided the world into three geographical mega-regions. On one side of the grand chessboard of our planet was the so-called heartland, the Great Plains of Eurasia, while on the other was the outer or insular crescent, the Americas, Africa, Australia, and Asia. Between these two sides, he identified a region of endless conflict called Rimland, or inner crescent, vaguely covering the shores of Eurasia from Western Europe all the way to Southeast Asia through the Middle East and India. Global geopolitical dynamics in the past couple of centuries can be described as an endless struggle between the powers dominating the heartland and those in the outer crescent, usually countries united by railways versus countries united by ships. The scene of this struggle has been the Rimland over and over again, but the part of the Rimland in which the struggle has taken place has differed in each period. Now, since the end of the Cold War, and as far as I have to say the US and its Western European allies were concerned, the Cold War meant, the end of the Cold War meant the shifting of their interests to the Middle East, and we saw, as a result of that, a series of endless wars and largely failed attempts to export democracy. The US withdrawal from Afghanistan, the creation of AUKUS, signaled yet another shift, like the previous ones, to the Indo-Pacific area as one of the primary battlegrounds for the next phase of global geostrategic competition between China and the US and their respective allies. The first big sign of this, at least as far as the West is concerned, I think Asia has obviously been paying greater attention to its own affairs and been more aware of these changes. The first big intrusion in our minds was AUKUS, which is very largely the result of Beijing's aggressive and expansionist policies in recent years, including, that is from our standpoint, including the seizure and militarization of islands in the South China Sea, the military incursion into northeast India, the breaking of the international treaty guaranteeing Hong Kong's democracy for 50 years, its oppression of the Uyghurs, and overall its arrogance in dealing with other powers. As an example of that, I'll mention Scott Morrison, former Australian Prime Minister, told the writer Walter Russell Mead in a Wall Street Journal interview that Beijing had demanded that Canberra remedy 14 Chinese grievances. The demands included it stop funding anti-China research, refrain from actions like requesting a more thorough World Health Organization investigation into the origins of COVID-19, stop opposing strategic Chinese investments into Australia, and block private media outlets from publishing unfriendly news stories about China. That kind of diplomacy defeats itself. Not only did Morrison set about attempting to persuade the Americans to create AUKUS, but as a deterrent to Chinese adventurism, but of course that new alliance would tend to have the impact of encouraging resistance, emboldening resistance even from Chinese neighbors who would never think of joining it. In short, China has largely constructed a potent combination of powers against itself. Beijing has made it plain, and I get away from my emphasis on AUKUS now, Beijing has made it plain it will campaign as best it can to block AUKUS. But the problem for Beijing is, and I think this is beginning to dawn on its leaders, the problem for Beijing is that the more aggressively it behaves, the more it encourages third parties to join or cooperate with AUKUS, even without such encouragement. But of course, the developments in Asia have their own domestic and regional foundations. And there's already been a significant increase in cooperation between, on the one hand, the United States as a great Asian power and its neighbors. In recent years, the US has established an important set of new relationships with Japan, India, and Australia. The Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, or Quad, which denies it's a defense organization, but held its first naval maneuvers, but has held naval maneuvers, and which, of course, China treats as a hostile organization. Now, the origins almost of the cooperation, particularly between the Quad members, is the occasion in which all of them cooperated in order to bring about assistance to the victims of the tragic but significant tsunami which destroyed so many lives and in a few years ago. The way in which Japan, America, and the other powers of the area cooperated in the humanitarian operation was in many respects a very significant step towards different kinds of cooperation. Now, I think at this point I'm going to hand over to to the experts. I want to say I'm grateful we are for having the cooperation of such distinguished people as the Center Head and Senior Fellow of the National Security and Strategic Studies and International Security Studies, Lieutenant General R.K. Sone, who is with the Vivekananda International Foundation of India. Thank you very much. Gurai Saini, the co-founder Council for Strategic and Defense Research in India. Hideshi Takuchi, President of the Research Institute for Peace and Security, and Japan's first ever Vice Minister of Defense for International Affairs, and our resident senior fellow, John Sagronis, full-time professor of statecraft and national security affairs at the Institute of World Politics in Washington, and a former member of the NSC. I'm particularly indebted on this occasion to my two colleagues, and I'm going to hand over to one of them now, Chaba Barnabas Horvath, a senior researcher in the institute here. He has been the person who has been mainly putting this initiative together with our friends from Asia. I want to thank him for that and ask him now if he would take over the microphone and introduce the first panel. Thank you very much.
Well, in the first panel, we will discuss the quadrilateral security dialogue that John mentioned, the partnership between Australia, India, Japan, and the United States. So I would ask our speakers to come to the stage for the first panel. Okay, so I would ask our technical staff if the PPT of Professor Tokuchi, if everything is arranged for that. Okay. Thank you. So each of the speakers will give a short talk, if they wish to, in the beginning, and then after that we will have a roundtable discussion. So first I would ask Dr. Tokuchi to give his speech. Okay, so yes, your PPT is already on the screen. So. Okay.
Well, good morning, everyone. I'm very much delighted to be here again. First of all, let me thank the Danube Institute, particularly Dr. O'Sullivan and my friend Chaba, for inviting me to this great conference again. Well, okay. As time is very much limited, I'd like to cover these 3 points. First of all, the Quad is a unique group of countries with these characteristics. First, it is a partnership to engage India with the US-centered alliance network in the Indo-Pacific region or Asia-Pacific region. Both Japan-US and US-Australia relations are alliances. And today, the Japan-Australia relationship is approaching to the level of alliance. Therefore, the only weak link is with India. And the second, the Quad is not an alliance anyway. India remains autonomous, we know. The Quad framework does not obligate its members to act jointly in military terms, in particular against common adversaries. And third, all the Quad partners are major responsible actors in the Indo-Pacific and aim to uphold the rules-based international order. Although India remains a revisionist power, its strategic orientation seems to be shifting very rapidly. And fourth, these 4 countries are maritime countries. And fifth, related to the fourth point, the Quad is a leading partnership to achieve the vision for free and open Indo-Pacific, or FOIP. And if I may add one more point, Quad works as a mechanism to bind Western industrial democracies in the region and India as the leader of the global South. This point is very, very important to achieve global agendas such as climate change and pandemics. Well, the next point is about the convergence of national interests of the Quad partners. These, the said points lead to convergences of national interests of the Quad members. China's maritime expansion is undermining the regional balance of power. China is trying to alter the status quo by force and coercion. Therefore, countering China's maritime expansion is in our critical interest. The importance of the freedom of the sea couldn't be overstated because these 4 countries are maritime states, and also as the entire Indo-Pacific is a large seascape. It is not just about addressing China's expansion. Many other issues such as maritime environment and natural disasters remain important agenda for cooperation, but China has been causing a long shadow. As Dr. Sullivan a little bit mentioned, the origin of the Quad is often thought to be the Tsunami Core Group established for the coordination of relief efforts in the aftermath of the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami and earthquake. It is a practical and operational initiative. And also, we should recall that this origin does not have nothing to do with countering China. However, we should also recall that it took the 4 countries 13 years to officially start the Quad coordination after the launch of the Tsunami Core Group. So the Quad partnership is not taken for granted. they need political energy to keep up the momentum. Next point, evolution of the Quad and IPMDA. The Quad is evolving, expanding, and being institutionalized in recent years. Joint leaders' statement, namely the spirit of the Quad of March 2021, made it clear that the Quad is a leading body to promote the visions for free and open Indo-Pacific. An example of such development is Indo-Pacific Partnership for Maritime Domain Awareness, or IPMDA. The Quad leaders' statement of May 2022 launched IPMDA in order to respond to humanitarian and natural disasters and also to combat IUU fishing. Its main focus is on the Indian Ocean, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific Islands, which are identical to Japan's focus of enhanced connectivity in its new plan for free and open Indo-Pacific, which was launched by former Prime Minister Kishida in New Delhi in March 2023. Information sharing is the basis of security cooperation and particularly important in early warning, swift response, collective or individual. And it is also important in order to mitigate resource limitations of each partner. As the region is a vast seascape, unity of efforts of like-minded countries for maritime security based on facts is a key to effective response. Right now, the scope of IPMDA is limited to IUU fishing, humanitarian crisis, climate events, but there are other serious challenges at sea. For example, smuggling of drugs and human and submarine operations, destruction of maritime environment, even air search and rescue. It will not be easy to widen the scope of IPMDA, but how to do it will be a big issue to achieve a free and open Indo-Pacific. Even in tackling with those non-traditional issues, the Quad has a problem in expanding its partnership. If the Quad is viewed only as an instrument to counter China, it will not be easy for example, Southeast Asians to cooperate with the Quad because the South China Sea is located in the middle of the entire Indo-Pacific, connecting the two great oceans. The Quad partnership with ASEAN makes a lot of sense. ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific, or AOIP, is an important document in this regard. ASEAN's will to undertake cooperation in a broad range of areas is clear, and maritime cooperation is its first priority in the document. Because AOIP, ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific, provides a guide for ASEAN's engagement with the Asia-Pacific and Indian Ocean region, efforts to generate synergy for the FOIP vision and AOIP is indispensable. And finally, I would like to touch upon IUU fishing and China's military, just in brief. IUU fishing is not just about fishing industry or about environmental destruction caused by predatory fishing. Reportedly, 95% of illegal fishing in the Indo-Pacific are done by the Chinese. Presumably, there are a number of Chinese maritime militia among them. Chinese maritime militia is, of course, part of China's military forces. And in order to become a great maritime power and maintain and expand maritime rights and interests, China has tried to coordinate various maritime actors, namely PLA Navy, China Coast Guard, maritime militia. And it also includes police and civilians and government and the CCP, Chinese Communist Party. Information sharing is essential for these various agencies to take coordinated actions. In the eye of the PLA, one of the most important roles of the China Coast Guard and the maritime militia is reconnaissance, surveillance, and especially active patrolling. Taking advantage of its large number and equipment, the Chinese maritime militia is primarily tasked with activities which are difficult to carry out by other maritime actors. By integrating the China Coast Guard and maritime militia into the military chain of command, the Chinese leadership seeks to create gray zone situations constantly and exert pressure on the opponents while avoiding direct military clashes. There is a report that report that most of the Chinese vessels are not visible from AIS system once they get close to China's shores, and that more than 60% of ships in the area have disappeared. They go dark by avoiding detection, by turning off AIS transponders and disguising their origins and destinations. So, use of satellites to detect the radio frequency emission from ships operating in the Chinese waters might be useful. And to be honest, the main target is, of course, China. But if we cannot say so in public because different partners have different relations with China, then careful coordination as well as candid and private discussions with those partners, particularly with Southeast Asians, will be very, very necessary. I stop here. Thank you very much for your attention.
I think we can proceed counterclockwise, so I would ask General Sony to give his talk. As you like, as you like.
Yeah. Thank you.
And one of the microphones over there. Okay.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I am Lieutenant General Ravi Sani, retired from the Vivekananda International Foundation. After nearly 4 decades-long career in the Army, I had a good fortune to be the founding member of the Vivekananda International Foundation. Let me start with conveying my gratitude to the Danube Institute for their kind invitation. It's a great joy for me to be visiting this very beautiful country for the 3rd time. I think every time one comes to Budapest, it looks lovelier. Hungary and India, ladies and gentlemen, have a lot in common than we admit, especially in terms of our political and strategic thinking. I look at it and I have been told to speak on both the channels. So I have got one script, so I'll divide it into 2. So you will have to suffer me twice, actually. So I'll start off with saying that I have to, on the geopolitics of Indo-Pacific. Coming from one of the Asia's biggest countries, I can well understand the European interest in knowing more about Indo-Pacific. What is it exactly? A construct, a region, or a strategy? And why does it give rise to Indo-China, US-China rivalry? What are the Quad and AUKUS alliances? What is the IMEC, or the India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor? And where does India fit into all this? I shall try and attempt to discuss all these questions and a lot more within the time allotted. So I think moderator will have to pardon me if I overshoot my time a little bit. I'll try. Ladies and gentlemen, in recent time there has been a lot of talks about multipolarity. The Indian Foreign Minister, who is a very articulate man, has defined this term very aptly. Multipolarity, in a sense, means multiple centers of power and influence in the world, rather than one dominant superpower or a bipolar rivalry. It really shifts international politics more in the direction of finding convergences and overlaps. Thus, what we see in terms of world today is really how the politics of convergence plays out amidst a fast-changing geostrategic environment. Americans themselves admit that post-Cold War order is over. In that context, Asia is the cutting edge of geopolitical change. that has yet to find its new equilibrium. Multipolar world, ladies and gentlemen, we think is possible only if there is multipolar Asia. Even as the Indo-US strategic competition deepens, several conflicts have flared up, including in the heart of Europe, Indo-Pacific, West Asia, Africa, etc. Every aspect of the geo-economic order is being weaponized. Technology is the new frontier being coveted by nations to exert and extend their domination in the global matters. With the economic rise of Asia, the Indo-Pacific Ocean combined has replaced, in my view, the Atlantic-Pacific Ocean region as the new hub of strategic and economic activity. Further, the growing interlinkages and dependencies between the Indian Ocean and Pacific region has led the two economic and geopolitical distinct regions to be combined into a single supra-strategic region, which till recently was its sub-regional security and supply structures, with numerous maritime choke points and a major disruption anywhere in the region will have a large repercussion on the interest of all major powers. And the future of Indo-Pacific will be strengthened or shaken by how they get along with each other. The Indo-Pacific today is a hotbed of some of the most contested flashpoints in terms of traditional conflicts of strategy and resources, namely Taiwan Straits, South China Sea, Korean Peninsula, etc. The region also faces challenges of non-traditional security threats such as piracy, terrorism, and climate change. In the recent times, China has often mentioned how its period of strategic opportunity coincides with the increased challenges and rising uncertainties. China today is facing serious geopolitical and geo-economic headwinds. In the work report presented by Xi at the 20th Party Congress, he noted, quote, confronted with the drastic changes in the international landscape, especially external attempts to blackmail, contain, blockade, and exert maximum pressure on China, we have put our national interests first, focused on internal political concerns, and maintained firm strategic resolve. We also have a fighting spirit and a firm determination never to yield or to coercive power. This facet, as articulated by Xi Jinping, requires to be noted. The Indo-Pacific economic landscape is marked by significant regional interdependencies, but lacks a cohesive economic architecture. With the limited free trade agreements connecting the Indian and Pacific Oceans, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, that is APEC, and East Asia Summit, EAS, have made limited gains in the regional economic integration, often sidetracked by pressing political issues. The US has been particularly struggling to define a new trading paradigm as unfettered trade has become a sore point in US economic politics. The Indo-Pacific Economic Frameworks launched in 2022 is designed to address key challenges facing the region, including economic integration, climate change, digital economic issues, and global supply chain disruption, but has no section on market access. Now coming quickly to Quad, also known as Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, comprising United States, Japan, India, and Australia. It traces its origin to 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, where the four countries coordinated disaster relief efforts. The initiative was formally proposed in 2007 by then Japanese Prime Minister Abe, who envisioned, I quote, a democratic security diamond to counterbalance China's influence, The Quad gained renewed momentum in 2017 under the Trump administration, reflecting shared commitment to a free, open Indo-Pacific. The revival was driven by China's increasingly aggressive behavior, the need to ensure freedom of navigation in international waters, and a desire to promote a rule-based order in the region. China has sought to change status quo and heighten tensions in the region, including militarization of disputed territory, dangerous use of its coast guards, and attempts to disrupt other peoples from exploiting their offshore resources. Quad's strategic objectives include security and defense cooperation, economic collaboration, technical partnerships, and humanitarian and disaster relief efforts. Notable initiatives include conducting joint military exercises like the annual Malabar naval exercises, enhancing interoperability among the navies of the four countries, and the Quad vaccine partnership in 2021, which was aimed at enhancing vaccine production and distribution in the Indo-Pacific to combat COVID-19. With regard to Quad, there are many questions on whether Quad has been able to deter aggressive behavior of China or not. This is something, ladies and gentlemen, we will have to ponder about. For the US alliance system to purely address security concerns, on 15th September 21, US, Australia, and the UK signed the Trilateral Security Pact called AUKUS. Under this pact, the three countries decided to enhance security cooperation among themselves to include sharing of technologies and information with the aim of bolstering each other's security and defense capabilities. The AUKUS was focused on deeper integration of security-related defense technologies and science industrial bases and supply chains. The flagship project under the AUKUS involves the US and UK helping Australia to build, I repeat, nuclear-powered submarines. After AUKUS, there have been concerns on geopolitical efficacy of the Quad, whether it should cut down on its expensive geo-economic agenda. Now, some experts continue to support the idea behind Quad not being a military alliance, as China may have reacted very differently if it was so, if it was something like NATO. Some argue that Quad's very flexibility allows for shaping stronger security cooperation depending on the situation ahead. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this particular thing is worth noting. It is not a security cooperation pact, but it does have the flexibility. How do you take it? It is for you to judge. On the other hand, some other experts contend how Asia's wide geo-economic agenda has served to address regional concerns and bring ASEAN on board, whose central role in the region cannot be discounted. Yet some others note there is actually a fairly detailed security agenda, including new challenges of cybersecurity, climate change, etc. For India, however, Quad remains a prominent pillar in its foreign and strategic policy, and the establishment remains committed to supporting it. Over the last 2 decades, both India and the US have shown a strong imperative to deepen strategic ties at the highest level. Today, the India-US comprehensive global and strategic partnership is spread across a very vast spectrum of engagements. Though there is a strong convergence of interests, ladies and gentlemen, these are not exactly congruent. Now, this is a point to be noted. As India faces its own geopolitical landscape, despite occasional spats and hiccups, There is a strong bipartisan consensus in both India and the US on the importance of this strategic convergence. This partnership has been strengthened by numerous defense agreements like the Logistics Exchange Memorandum of Agreement 2016, Communication Compatibility and Security Agreement 2018, Industrial Security Agreement 2019, and the Basic Exchange and Cooperation Agreement 2020, Memorandum of Intent for Defense Innovation Cooperation 2018, and Security of Supply Agreement 2023. US has also designated India as major defense partner and a NATO-like ally. The Initiative for Critical Emergency and Emergency Technologies of ISAT, launched in 2023, has been path-breaking. Structures as a pathway for regular exchanges on industrial and technological cooperation, it has provided a degree of confidence in the market to make bets and forge alliances that many thought were impossible earlier, including on semiconductors. The current situation of external turmoil and uncertainty, we have seen security trumping over economics, from the breakdown of global supply chains, financial payment systems, logistics, inflationary trade headwinds, energy and food crisis showing indebtedness, etc. There is a dangerous storm coming with increasing normalization of force in international relations. This has led to an escalated nuclear rhetoric. Can I have a bit of water, I think? Water. Sorry. I suppose I have spoken too much, that's why my throat has gone dry. Thank you. That has led to an escalated nuclear rhetoric that threatens to undermine the entire humanity. In such a scenario, China has sought to usurp the narrative in global governance. As the West remains distracted in Ukraine, China's new initiatives, that is the Global Development Initiative and the Global Security Initiative, seek to voice concerns on Global South. They have done this in the background of much touted Build Back Better World or EU Global Gateway Infrastructure Initiative to counter BRI having hardly moved forward. In fact, even on the climate change, China has been very vocal on climate finance. This is a challenge that needs to be addressed with utmost priority. Can India play a role here? Definitely. As India showed during its G20 presidency, India can be a pragmatic voice and look to aid concerns of the Global South. Ladies and gentlemen, Trump's re-election as the President of the United States for the second term has created fresh uncertainties globally, including in the Indo-Pacific region. It was Trump who had taken the initiative to meet Kim Jong-un and made an attempt to normalize relations with North Korea. With North Korean soldiers joining Russia-Ukraine war, there is a mixing of European and Indo-Pacific security structure. While Mr. Trump said he is committed to dealing with the rising China, he has also promised to help end the Ukraine war. The senior cabinet members announced so far are China hawks. There are many uncertainties and many guesses made at this stage would be hasty. What is going to happen in future is open to many interpretations. My own profession as a soldier and my cultural background of the Indian civilization makes me an internal optimist. The power of dialogue, in my view, has always proven effective, yielding tangible results that contribute to stability on the global stage. India believes genuine long-term solutions in global problems can only be achieved when when the nations engage constructively and respect each other's perspective. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen, for patiently listening to me.
Our next speaker, Gaurav Saini.
Thank you so much. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for having me for this very important conversation. It's indeed an honor to see the Danube Institute trying to create a conversation in an increasingly interlinked world where we are seeing the European security order linked very closely to what's happening in Asia and the Indo-Pacific. Before I begin, I would like to make two disclaimers. The first is that I'm not very sure, but I do not think, at least for the past 2 years, any of the Quad partners, India, Australia, US, and Japan, from the government, define the Quad as the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue. They simply call it the Quad. So that's first. I think that's very important to keep in mind, and I'll come to why that is so. Second, the title of the panel, Future of the Quad. So I don't claim to be a reader of the future. So I'm not going to make any promises. I am an independent researcher based at a think tank in New Delhi. What I will do is try and convince you of my arguments of how I see the Quad and what lies in its future. And I'll do that based on my assessment of the trends that we've seen with the Quad and that we are perhaps, more importantly, are going to see. Having said that, I think I'm going to make just 3 points, and I'll try and convince you of all 3. First, what is the Quad? I'll offer a very short definition. Second, my argument is that the Quad is here to stay. This is not something new. This has been said by multiple government officials from the 4 Quad partners. And third, the Quad will stay in the manner that it has stayed till now, which is it will not become an Asian NATO. And I'll tell you why. So let's come to the first part. What is the Quad? In my assessment, I think the Quad is essentially a diplomatic mechanism for dialogue between 4 maritime democracies. That's how it was imagined, and that's how it's played out. We will get into the depth of why it works, because that's part of the definition. Again, looking at the trends of how it has worked. But let's come to the second point. Why do I believe that the Quad is here to stay? I think there are some fundamental reasons that are beyond the Quad that will make sure that the Quad stays. And the first of it is China, obviously. And I'm not going to repeat some of the things that my co-panelists have already spoken about in terms of what China is doing, what India is doing, or what Japan is doing. But I think 3 factors are not going to change in China. One is its policy of economic entanglement and coercion to a large degree. In the world, in Europe, in the Indo-Pacific, in Asia, if you see some of the statistics that I have, its manufacturing trade surplus increased by about $775 billion between 2019 and 2023, which is more than Belgium's entire GDP. With ASEAN, it has more than doubled between 2019 and 2023, rising from 3 to 6% of the region's GDP. A subset of this economic engagement and entanglement is standards, China's standards plan, which is trying to set standards on niche technologies. Second aspect of why China will remain the way it is the aspect of geographic coercion. Pushing on its boundaries, trying to settle its boundaries on its own terms. Whether you see what happened between India and China in 2020, and there's a history to that. There have been incidents before that, or what China does in the South China Sea. That's not going to change. Similarly, the third point is China's aim or its objectives of emerging as a global leader, ideological leader. So the 3 initiatives that were spoken about, civilization initiative, development and security initiative, go together to essentially posit China in the world as an alternative to the US-led liberal order, right? Now, none of this, from everything that we have in terms of scholars on China, is going to change. Therefore, the Quad is here to stay. The second reason why I think the Quad is here to stay is because there's great overlaps between the visions of how the Indo-Pacific as a construct, as a region, should prosper, should go forward. There are great overlaps between how Japan, Australia, India, and the US look at the region. I'm not going to go into the details of this because I think this is a very aware audience. The third reason why I feel the Quad is here to stay is because there are inherent benefits for all of the Quad partners in their bilateral relationships. Only one has been mentioned here, for example, India and the US relationship. There's been a dramatic transformation in how India and the US look at each other. In 2023, 50% of India's defense exports were to the US. This was unimaginable earlier. Some of the acquisitions that we're doing now, some of the platforms that we are buying from the US or US-based companies have promises of being co-produced, manufactured with transfer of technology in India. They have established institutional mechanisms, the ISET, which was mentioned, the IDEX, which is an Indian institutional mechanism. So they're trying to create these synergies between the two ecosystems so that India can benefit from US technologies, US know-how, etc., etc. Similarly, I think another important aspect of the India-US relationship is these two things. One is called the Logistics Exchange Memorandum of Agreement and the Communications Compatibility and Security Agreement, the LEMOA and the COMCASA. These are logistics agreement, and under this, India and US have also signed maintenance repair agreements wherein US auxiliary ships can now dock at Indian facilities and get repairs done. This is very important, especially in a future contingency, a conflict that happens in the region. Please keep in mind that US naval ships are not going to dock. These are going to be the support ships that are going to come in and do. But that's an important development. So India benefits greatly. What does the US get in return? The fact that India, maybe 15 years ago, was perhaps imagining a joint future in Asia with China, where both of them could grow together. But American foreign policy has been successful in making sure that does not happen. I would not give the entire credit to America. Rather, it was China that made that happen, and also, obviously, great politicking in India and diplomatic, expertise. So we've already heard how Australia benefits, not directly from the Quad, but indirectly. The AUKUS came after the Quad. The conversation started there. Maybe they led to certain frustrations, and maybe another way was found to give Australia what it wants. But beyond that, the Quad also allows Australia to regain control of its immediate neighborhood. It's the Pacific Islands, for example. Similarly, I think there are benefits for Japan as well. Now, this is the third point that I was making. Remember, the first point was China is not going to change. The second was that the Indo-Pacific visions of these four Quad partners have major overlaps. And the third is that there are benefits. Who would not like to be a part of the Quad, and why would it not go forward if there are benefits? Now, I think the fourth and the most important point of why I think the Quad has a very bright future is because the Quad offers a new form of minilateralism, even multilateralism. And this question of what the Quad is has stumped academics all across the world. Because I have been an academic, I still am to a large degree in my research role. What academics do, and it is their job, is to fit what they observe in the world into very solid categories. So they look at the Quad and see, is it a multilateral organization? Is it institutionalized? Does it have a secretariat? Does it have a logo? And things like that. But what the Quad instead is a very proactive way of responding to regional exigencies, of making sure that four maritime economies, maritime democracies can essentially join their hands together and respond. And the reason I say that is that the Quad allows for purpose-based engagements and cooperation between large, middle, and small powers. Each of the four Quad partners have very different capabilities. And they also have the very different constraints vis-a-vis China. Japan and India are the closest to China. India shares a direct border. Japan shares contested islands with China. And each of them, therefore, have a very different interpretation of the threat perceptions from China and are, therefore, have a very different strategy of how much do they want to push when it comes to China. Right? This new form of minilateralism, this Quad or a diplomatic dialogue, also reflects, I believe, how the rest of the world has to now catch up to what China has been able to achieve in the past 2 decades. Some of it obviously facilitated by the US, by Europe, etc. So therefore, I think there are 5 reasons why the Quad, the way it is structured, the way it is functioned, is a success or will be a success. One, as I said, context-dependent objectives. Started as a tsunami core group, then responded with COVID vaccines. Now it's talking about cervical cancer. But at the same time, it has enabled cooperation vis-a-vis maritime exercises, vis-a-vis training, etc., right, in the region. Second, I think, is because the Quad is able to identify and build on mutual complementarities. India has something that it can give to the region. So let's bring India on. Japan has something. It's not either or. It's not signing a document, we all stand together, otherwise we don't stand at all. In the Indo-Pacific, I think showing up is half of the battle. And essentially that's what the Quad does when it builds on mutual complementarities. Third, I think ambiguity in form, but not in action. I know there are some criticisms of what the Quad has been able to achieve, and I'll come to those. But in the 4 bureaucracies, there is no confusion on what the Quad is about. I think the rest of the world is confused, but the 4 bureaucracies are absolutely not. They know exactly what it is for. And the multiple working groups that the Quad has formed meet very regularly to take these things forward. Some move faster, like the maritime domain awareness aspect. Others move more slowly. Fourth, I think, is something called zone balancing. It's a concept given by Arzan Tarapur from Stanford, who talks about this idea where the Quad essentially is trying to build capacity in the region. So this is a move away from the American foreign policy of hub and spoke. America at the center, and then everybody derives energy and capability and power from it. I think what is happening now, or what the attempt is, that capacity is built at the externalities. So a Vietnam is empowered, a Malaysia is empowered, or an India is empowered, and they together then have enough amongst themselves to stand up and say no to any kind of bullying, whether it's economic, security, or otherwise. Finally, I think, is the point of consistent engagement. These are 4 democracies. Democracies are messy. There are elections every 3 months in India, right? There are transitions of power. And our elections in the world have also become extremely contested. So, however, the Quad has maintained its steam. The structure of it, the way it's designed, the way it functions, allows different countries to take over at different points in time. So when a Biden cannot travel to Australia for a Quad summit, the Japanese arrange something on the sidelines of the G7, right? So things like that. There is adaptability. Because, as I said, the bureaucracies are very sure of why the Quad is necessary, right? So they make it happen. That's the power of bureaucracy, notwithstanding all the other criticisms. Now, the last part of what I wanted to say, which is future trends. What does it mean? Where will the Quad go? We will have to step back a little bit, and I won't speak more than 2 minutes more, right? As I said, the Quad was born out as a response to an exigency in the region. People needed help, and these 4 countries came together. It has been doing that consistently. Most recently, I think in Papua New Guinea, when there was a landslide, and the Quad responded in various mechanisms, right? But the Quad faces certain challenges when it comes to how it is perceived. In 2021, there was a very interesting survey that was done with Southeast Asian respondents in ASEAN countries. And if you look at their replies to some of the questions, one of the questions was, will the Quad force you to make a choice between US and China? And people said yes. More than 50% people said yes, it is going to do that. will it impinge on your freedom and agency to make decisions on your foreign policy? And a lot of people said yes. That survey was repeated into 2023. It's called the State of Southeast Asia Survey by the ICS in Malaysia. Singapore, sorry. And if you look at the results now, people have responded saying that the Quad is not forcing us to make choices, right? But they're still not very clear what the Quad is. So in my assessment, what has happened is, when you look at something for the first time, it's a very evolutionary response to be scared of it, to not be sure what it'll do to you. And from fear, you move to confusion, which is very good. Now you're ready to learn, right? So that in the region, I think this year, the percentage had come down a lot. And in fact, 40% of respondents saw the Quad as beneficial, right? We will, I think, be discussing some of this in the second panel as well in terms of perceptions. But that's one part of where the Quad is going. Its perceptions are improving, it's getting its act together, there's more and more that's being committed. I cannot project the next 5 years, but I know that we can look at what was declared or what was spoken at the Wilmington Declaration in Delaware, the last Quad summit. And if you see some of the things in my assessment, it's as if the Quad decided together that next year is going to be India's year at the Quad. So the reason I say that is because India is going to be hosting something called the Maritime Initiative for Training in the Indo-Pacific, MITRE. Again, a very important aspect. This is India's strong suit. India has something called the Indian Technical and Economic Cooperation Program, wherein it trains the diplomats and other people from different countries. It's done that for more than 200,000 officials from more than 160 countries. India is also going to commission a study on ports under the Quad to sort of understand how the Quad can perhaps play a role there. And the last point I want to make is, we have also seen that when the Quad initially began, it started talking about a public goods agenda. And from the outside, it seemed to me that people who were behind the scenes trying to make the Quad work were throwing or juggling a lot of balls. And they would wait and see which one is it that sticks or which is the one that they are able to catch. But I think there's been an important learning curve. Initially, there was a lot of criticism that a lot of things that the Quad talks about in terms of public goods are not very close to the public. When you talk about maritime domain awareness, when you talk about undersea cable connectivity, these are things that are absolutely essential. But the public does not really see benefit directly, right? Now, if you see what the Quad is trying to do, is bring in initiatives that have a direct benefit nature to the public, because that helps the Quad in the kind of perceptions that it generates. So you have infrastructure fellowship that are being given to Southeast Asians so that they can train themselves better. So the Australian government is doing that. Similarly, as I said, the cancer moonshot, which is for cervical cancer, which is a major problem in Asia. So in that sense, I think what has happened is that from confusions about what it wants to do, it's getting clarity. But one thing it has never been confused about is the necessity of the Quad, is the necessity of the four countries to work together for stability and prosperity in the region. And I think the prosperity aspect is what we will talk about in the second panel. Thank you.
Okay, so now we can start our roundtable discussion. And oh, sorry. Go on. Sorry.
How much
My bad.
time?
Sorry. 10 minutes, as you like.
10 minutes. Okay.
Well, it doesn't need to be 10 minutes as you like.
First, I'd like to thank you, Csaba, Melissa, John, who's not here, István, for inviting me to this panel. But I have a confession to make. I am not an expert on the Quad, and this reminds me of an earlier slide that my colleague had put up about the tsunami in December of 2004. I was in government, and I got a call in the middle of the night from the Deputy Secretary of State telling me that there's a tsunami, what are we going to do about it? And as I'm waking up this is around the Christmas holiday season, I was thinking tsunami, where and what are we going to do? It completely shocked me. But because of my role as a senior director for policy implementation and execution, I had to think about how are we going to respond to this tsunami practically. And I recall that China had almost no presence whatsoever in the response to the tsunami. In fact, at that time, we were concerned about the impression we were giving to the world with our generosity and how it would be received, particularly by Muslim communities in Indonesia, those that may have been sympathetic to Al-Qaeda, and the communities that were more supportive of a more extreme Muslim community, Muslim ideology. And we received a tremendous, if you would say, bounce of popularity and support. Later on, in 2007, I attended a senior directors meeting at the White House and the National Security Council staff to assess our strategy to deal with China. And I'd like to, I don't know if it's up, or originally the slide was US-China rivalry, and that's what I'd like to briefly talk about, because I know we don't have an awful lot of time. There was pretty much disagreement within minutes as to how the United States should pursue its relations with China, what kind of strategy we should develop, in part because we were surprised. We never imagined being a rival of China. I think for the longest time, our expectations were to engage the Chinese people, the Chinese government, draw them into the global economic world order. They were a member of the Security Council and would reinforce the international rule of law. And we didn't have any military concerns with them at that time. But what has happened? Clearly, China sees us as a rival. And we introduced terms in the U.S. government, strategic competition with China. It used to be great power competition, but we didn't want to give credit to the Russians as being a great power, so we modified the term to strategic competition, primarily with China. The military uses the expression pacing challenge with China, and the conference today earlier mentioned U.S.-China rivalry. Now, my way of thinking, even though I'm a professor right now, I hate to say that I'm an academic. I'm more of a practitioner, as my other colleagues would like to consider themselves being. As scholar practitioners, what is the practicality of being in a rivalry with China, or what is the nature of the competition, or what does it mean to be in a pacing challenge? I think sometimes we evaluate the competition in terms of who is first, or who is bigger, or who is best. I'd rather have the better economy than the largest economy. The composition of an economy matters a lot more than the size of the economy. I do believe, with all my heart, that the future is with the U.S. economy and not China. China is not the future for the world. As large as it may be, I think the quality and the composition is fragile. We support and have been the primary advocates for international law after the Second World War, and I think we need to remind members of the global international community that international law is important, and those countries that violate it ought to be sanctioned for it. Militarily, we never envisioned being a competitor of China, but we pause and have to acknowledge that they have seen us as a military competitor, and we ask why. The recent revelation of China developing a pretty substantial, and this is doesn't get much of the press, but a pretty substantial nuclear force, a strategic nuclear force that is vastly different from their doctrine of years ago, which was to ensure that they had a sufficient deterrent against any country that might strike them, and that's all they needed. We never intended to strike China, maybe other countries did, but now they've developed a strategic posture that is what we would say first strike capable. And we have to wonder what went into the thinking of the Chinese leadership that they pursued such a path for strategic nuclear capability to pose against the United States. It requires us to now think for the first time of a deterrent strategy in the United States that has to address not only the Russians, which we have long developed a strategic posture against, but now the Chinese. Economically, we all know, I think most of us believe that COVID, the Wuhan virus, as President Trump originally wanted to name it, the Chinese were very effective at in their public diplomacy to get the world to now refer to it as COVID, not Wuhan. Okay, but what was China's response globally to that response to assisting the world after the release of the virus? It wasn't one of, hey, we're sorry, or we don't know what went on, but let's help the world. No, it was one of trying to penetrate U.S. research labs to find a vaccine and ignore the fact that they were responsible for it. This is not the actions of a responsible global leader. I don't believe that there's a rivalry that I'm not even sure what we're competing against, other than for us to continue to pursue rule of law, promote liberal democracies and vibrant economies. I don't believe we should penetrate or try to influence the internal dynamics of countries' political systems. I think we've learned our lesson over and over again, and more recently in Iraq and Afghanistan, and certainly here. But to continue on the path that I think President Trump is going to take us, which is one of addressing practical solutions to existing problems, not necessarily develop a long-term strategy on what the future of U.S.-China relations are. He's going to take them one at a time. He's putting together an administration of what many would like to say are China hawks, whether it's the nominee at the State Department, Senator Rubio, for the Secretary of State, or Congressman Waltz, the National Security Advisor, Alex Wong, his deputy on the National Security Council, others throughout the administration that are going to pressure China in ways that they may not have experienced certainly in the last 4 years. So put your money on U.S. I think it's the future. I believe it's the future, and I'll leave it at that.
Thank you for your talk. So now we can start our roundtable discussion, and maybe the first topic that I think is maybe the most urgent topic right now, like what each of you expect from the incoming Trump presidency on both U.S.-China relations and the Quad.
I think this administration will pursue some economic pressure on China. There's talk of substantial tariffs, which I think, from an economic standpoint, are not preferred, but from a political standpoint, I think are going to be beneficial. China's economy is not as strong as it may appear to many people. Their behavior has been counterproductive. I've told many businessmen in the past that they are used to economic competition in the United States or among like-minded economies where the rule of law, regulations, adjudication over economic transactions are recognized, whether you're Hertz and Avis or Coke or Pepsi or Lockheed Martin and BAE. Those companies are used to the government or governments of regulating commerce and economic interaction. But with respect to China, one's engaged in economic warfare. I mean, there's a government that's behind the state champions of China that are unduly influencing economic behavior, and I think the Trump administration is going to come down pretty hard on them. I've traveled the world. I mean, China's everywhere, but despite their pretty aggressive Belt and Road Initiative and developing infrastructure around the world to improve the economy, they can't take it with them. So eventually they will, whether they encourage or they create an environment where countries are found to be in debt trap financing, nonetheless, they're not going to be able to take the massive construction of a port in Colombo, Sri Lanka with them, or Panama Canal, or the mining in Chile or Peru, or wherever they may be around the world. So I would rather we piggyback on those efforts and complement those activities rather than be fearful of them. Again, I believe the future is with the United States.
And of course, my question also refers on what you may expect from the incoming Trump presidency in U.S.-India relations and U.S.-Japan relations as well, not just the Quad, of course.
How do you manage this? Yeah. I think as far as India is concerned, you see, it has to be answered from the political perspective. And it would be appropriate to quote our foreign minister, who said that there are lots of countries which are going to be uncomfortable with coming of Mr. Trump. India is not one of those countries. That I think I'd like to put across to you very, very sort of emphatically. Mr. Trump, as the people say, is a very predictably very unpredictable, but there is I would say, a method in the madness. I think the Chinese should be worried because the unfair trade practices would not give them much of heavy heft as it used to do earlier. So as was brought out by my American colleague, they are going to be comfortable, and in my view, they deserve to be slightly uncomfortable. The point is that you cannot dominate the economic atmosphere by carrying out practices which are less than open and less than fair. So that is one particular point. And you see this Belt and Road Initiative, what we have seen in our neighborhood. I'll take the example of Sri Lanka. Actually, they reached a stage where India, we are not a rich country, not at all. We are a developing nation. We had to help them out by giving them almost $6 billion to rescue them because they had reached a certain level where they had to be rescued. So basically, the point is that the practices, trade practices which look to be very benign and very nice at the outlook, but if you go deeper into them, there are repercussions for that. So that, I think, is something which China was to be, was going to carry on those practices. With Mr. Trump's coming, I think there will be a halt to that.
Well, yeah. For Japan as well, the re-election of Donald Trump as the next president of the United States will be a big problem. Because, as already General said, he is very unpredictable, and also he is indifferent to basic principles of the rules-based international order, and also he is indifferent to alliances and partnerships. Therefore, our efforts to maintain and enhance the rules-based international order, and also to enhance the Quad, will be much, much more difficult. But for Japan, the United States will remain the most important security partner because Japan neighbors on 3 nuclear and authoritarian states: Russia, China, and North Korea, and they are more colluding with each other than before. So it is very important for Japan to enhance the credibility of U.S. extended deterrence. And also, the Japan, as far as Japan-U.S. alliance relationship is concerned, it is more institutionalized than ever before. It is not just a partnership, the political leaders of two countries. It is more institutionalized. Therefore, it is very, very important at this stage to enhance or expand the channels of communication and cooperation between the two countries. And also, it is very important for Japan and other, the allies of the United States in the Indo-Pacific, particularly, Australia and South Korea and the Philippines, and also involving NATO countries and the EU countries to keep engaging the United States in the world affairs. So therefore, it is not good to deplore his advent as the President of the United States, but rather we should we should explore the opportunities to enhance, our partnerships to engage to keep engaging the United States for the maintenance of the rules-based international order.
Not too much to add, but I think also from the Indian perspective, there is a sort of pragmatic functionalism to how Trump conducts his foreign policy. And that is also something that the Indian government prefers. Not just because of the present moment that it finds itself, but also in terms of the capabilities that it has and the kinds of outcomes that it desires in its immediate ecosystem. But there are larger order benefits that are expected with the Trump presidency in DC. One, obviously, is the war in Europe. I think there are expectations that perhaps it will be put to an end, and some semblance of stability, therefore, can take over global economic, order. Similarly, there is some expectation that in the Middle East there would be some sort of a peace or a deal that might happen. Again, this is all based on Trump's sort of trends of trying or always preferring to make a deal, right? Not out of thin air, but obviously based on some core national interests as well as long-term stability. So that is one part of it. I think on the Quad itself, there are, in my assessment, there should be no fears about the Quad's future with the Trump administration, because there is not too much commitment that it asks for. Everything that the Quad does or happens under the Quad umbrella, the US would anyway do under its power projection goals in the Indo-Pacific region. So that would anyway keep on happening. And as I said earlier, I think the Quad is structured in a way that others can step in. I think we had a Japanese panelist say that they would perhaps want to make more efforts. Similarly, each country in the Quad has its own things that it leads under the Quad umbrella. So from the Indian perspective, I don't see much anxiety vis-a-vis what Trump's presidency would do to the Quad or anything negative would happen to the Quad.
Thank you. And, now I have a question mainly for Professor Tsagronis. What do you think? I can see a paradox here that on the one hand, Trump's approach towards international trade is quite protectionist, like on the global level as well. But on the other hand, as he is quite hawkish on China, if he wants to contain China, then he will have to strengthen relations with Asian partners such as India and Japan. But to strengthen these partnerships, he may need to offer favorable terms in terms of international trade. So what do you think, how will he approach this kind of paradox? Like, in order to contain China, he would need to offer favorable terms in trade to his Asian partners, but that somewhat goes against his protectionist approach on international trade.
Well, first of all, I don't think it's a policy of containing China. I think it's to manage more favorably or equitably the economic relationship with China. I mean, China has entered into numerous trade agreements that are very unbalanced. I encourage people, if they want to really look at details, just examine what we call in the United States the Department of Justice indictments against a number of Chinese economic interests operating in the United States and the violations of laws, both our domestic and international laws, in their economic activity. So the Justice Department would call to the attention of the U.S. government the violations of law, and then it's up to the politicians and the judicial department to prosecute. But I don't think it's to contain China. It's to make them more responsible to the terms that they've agreed to, and to be a more benevolent or proactive economic engine in the country. The tariffs are, if they hold, will certainly hurt the Chinese economy. They will hurt the United States as well, that has enjoyed cheap Chinese imports. But I can live without toys made in China or parts made in China if they can be also produced in Canada or Mexico or Europe or elsewhere. I'm reminded of a story, just a little bit off an aside. I was in Monrovia, Liberia not long ago, and a Lebanese hotel owner was refurbishing a hotel, and he wanted to buy all kinds of parts, plumbing, electrical wiring, and so forth, the hotel. And he had a choice. He could buy parts made in Europe, primarily Germany, at 3-4 times the price than Chinese parts. And he chose to go with the Chinese parts because they were cheaper, but he found he had to replace them every couple of years because the quality was terrible. And he wishes that he had spent the initial investment with the better products that he wouldn't, over time, have to replace every so often. Not long after, I was in Tajikistan, and BYD, the very famous, I think it's now a growing Chinese auto manufacturer, had a number of vehicles on the road, many of them, but talking to a number of people who own them, they said, yeah, they're really cheap and they really look good, but their quality is not what comes out of Japan or South Korea or even the United States. So we pay for that lower costs of lower quality items, and I think the president is going to turn that around. We will feel the effects of his policies, but it's not to contain China; it's to make them more responsible. I do have a question for my colleagues here, and that is: could the Quad grow in numbers of participants?
You see the point. As far as the Quad is concerned, let me look at it from the military point of view. There are two threats which are emanating from China. One is on the continental side and other is on the maritime sphere. As far as the continental threat is concerned, as far as India is concerned, ladies and gentlemen, we have at the moment on the Himalayas approximately 100,000 troops deployed on the either side. We had a problem suddenly because we had 20 years peace and tranquility arrangement with us, and suddenly they chose to enter our territory, and of course we made sure that they were stopped, and we had a problem for about 4 years, and now we have decided to disengage. I'd like to bring across, as far as the continental threat is concerned, it spreads across the Himalayas approximately 2,000 kilometers. It's a very difficult terrain because I have commanded the course, which was approximately 1,400 kilometers across the Himalayas. The average height is about, in certain places, it exceeds about 16 to 17,000 feet above the sea level. The temperatures drop to about minus 40. I mean, in the sense that if you touch the tank, your skin comes off. But our troops are used to it. I went first to the Himalayas when I was all of 19 years old in 62. And subsequently, at that particular time, we had a problem. We were not prepared for this particular place. But when I took over as a corps commander, we are much more prepared. And in this area, our troops are used to the climate, they are climatized. And it is possible for us now to make sure that if nothing else, we'll deter them. If the Chinese come into that area, probably better sense will prevail. because they'll have to pay a heavy price. And now, of course, there is disengagement. We do hope the process continues to go as we think it should go. And there is disengagement. But de-induction of the troops is a problem which ultimately they have to decide. But what I want to put across to you is this, that as far as the continental threat from the Chinese is concerned, the Indian armed forces would be able to deter them. Now we come to the maritime dimension. The maritime dimension, according to us, Indo-Pacific, stretches from the east coast of Africa right up to the Atlantic. So there, in this particular area, as far as the Indian Ocean is concerned, that is from the east of the African African continent right up to the Malacca Straits, the Indian Navy is going to play a role into this area. And we feel that we are adequately equipped and armed to make sure that we don't allow Chinese to have a domination in conjunction with the other friendly countries, and of course with the cooperation of the other Quad countries. So as far as the area in the South China Sea, etc. are concerned, there of course the other Quad partners come in. And I also want to tell you that I'll just go purely on the military sort of a cooperation of the Quad countries are concerned, all the 4 countries. So we are not like NATO's, we don't have common platform. We have majority, not majority, but now it is at least about 16 to 70% of the equipment with us is of Russian origin. But we are capable of operating in conjunction with each other, as it has been shown in the Malabar exercises. And also, there have been bilateral engagement between the different Quad partners. So I'm talking about the eventualities which may never come, but I'll again like to put across that Quad is not like NATO. It is not a military, what do you call, a treaty or something like that, but the possibilities are there. And the Malabar exercises which we hold with all the 4 navies, that is our Navy, the American Navy, the Japanese and the Australians, that started off very small sort of a way, but they have been able to carry out exercises with each other, amongst each other for quite some time, for various eventualities. But once again, I want to put it absolutely clear that it is not a military sort of a treaty, or it is not something like NATO, but the possibilities, as I mentioned, if push comes to a shove, are very much there.
Do we have more time?
I think a few minutes for...
Okay, I'll just take a minute to answer the question you asked. In terms of, will the Quad grow? I get...
In membership.
In membership. Right. So, again, looking at trends, I have not seen a need amongst the 4 bureaucracies. There seems to be no incentive as well to push it in that direction, to get, let's say, a South Korea or a UK to join in, because those conversations have been happening, or there is a lot of advocacy that happens around that. But independently, I also don't see much utility, because I think it's quite possible, and it's already happened. You have an AUKUS, there's a conversation on JAUKUS, and then there's also a Squad. So there are these other permutations and combinations in which 1, 2, or 3 members of the Quad get together with a 3rd country or a 4th country, and so it's sort of an age of minilateralism, right? Get things done as soon as possible because there's no time to waste. So therefore, I don't see the need, because I think the costs, the diplomatic costs, would just be unnecessary. You would have a lot of blowback from Chinese, like it happened in 2017 or before. So there would be an unnecessary wastage of time and effort.
Okay, I would have one more quick question to our 2 Indian speakers. Like, India is also a member of BRICS and also a member of the Quad as well. So how looking from the outside, these seem to be 2 quite different, such as 2 different trajectories for India in the future. So which one is more prioritized, or how does India bring together in its grand strategy, its simultaneous membership in the BRICS and the Quad as well?
You see, Hungarians should not ask this question because they, they like us, have relations in multiple directions. You see, the point is that, as I mentioned in the beginning, there are possibilities, you see, of having relations in both sides and still be able to exert your independence. For example, we had a relationship with Russia and with Soviet Union, and I would say in that era, they came in very, very handy, because at that particular time, I recall 1971 when the problem started in then East Pakistan, now Bangladesh, and there was a problem there. The Pakistanis committed atrocities on their eastern wing, and they rose in rebellion, and there was a war. And in that war, it started off because there were about, I think, 10 to 15 million refugees from that East Pakistan who entered India, and we had no option but to take action, and that resulted in the eastern wing of Pakistan breaking off and becoming Bangladesh. And during that period, we had no option but to help them out with our armed forces. And at that time, American 7th Fleet came into the Indian Ocean, actually almost in support of Pakistan at that particular time. I'm mentioning that relationship. But from there, today the relationship has evolved. We are part of Quad, and there is a very robust relationship with America. But at the same time, we also have a relationship with Russia. So that is the point I wanted to bring across to you. And that is what is called multipolarity, you see. So that is what is being followed by quite a few nations. Now, you brought about the BRICS. The BRICS is also a relationship which was formed in 5 countries. That is us, the Russians, China, and I think South America, South Africa.
And South Africa and Brazil.
And, of course, Brazil, of course. So it started off with the 5 countries. But what has happened is that because of increased problems with the UN, there are quite a few countries which feel that their voice is not heard. And unfortunately, the UN has become a sort of a debating club in a building which is slightly dilapidated, where everybody comes and speaks for 2 minutes and then goes away, and lots of resolutions are passed, and there are arrest warrants are started off by some people there, and nobody bothers about them. You see, if UN was effective enough, there would have been no problem as far as the global South is concerned. And many other countries who are not part of global South. I think there is a quest in these countries to be heard. There is a quest in these countries to be listened to, and the quest in these countries for getting financial aid. The World Bank and IMF, I'm afraid, continues to impose conditions which are not acceptable to those countries. So somehow in that particular environment, there is these organizations like BRICS and SCO have come up. But as far as India is concerned, it is not a part of these alliances to do down West or America. So there are 2 types of cooperation in these organizations. That is the assertiveness, and there is also the, competitiveness. But in none of these organizations, there is ever an endeavor on the part of India to do down the West or US. So these are the multiple organizations which are being entered into by India and other countries to make sure that their national interests are guarded. but in no way they are something to do down the West or the US, because US continues to remain a very important partner as far as India is concerned.
So this is a dangerous question simply because we have an entire panel on it. So I will not be getting into the details at all. I'll reserve my comments for the second panel. But I think I will just say one line, which is that the question is posed, India between the BRICS and the Quad. I think from India's perspective, India is amongst the BRICS and the Quad. So, and I'll try and explain in the next panel why I think so.
Thank you. We don't have much time left, but maybe we have just a few minutes for questions from the audience, if there is any.
Thank you. My name is Rohit. I'm a researcher at university. It was a really inspiring presentation. My question concerns the case of Taiwan. What would your countries do in case the President Xi's promise that in the next decades China will reunite peacefully or non-peacefully with Taiwan? What would you act in that scenario? Thank you.
May I go first? The question of Taiwan is very, very important for Japan as well. It is simply because the distance, geographical distance between Taiwan and Japan is only 110 kilometers. Therefore, once a contingency occurs involving Taiwan, then it will automatically affect the national security of Japan as well. And since April 2021, not only Japan-US political documents, but also, diplomatic documents of many countries of Western, diplomatic documents of Western countries like, NATO and the EU or, US, Philippines, etc., refer to the importance of peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait. So the most important thing is deterrence of China's use of force against Taiwan. So therefore, the empowering, helping Taiwan acquire robust defense capability. That's, I think, the most important thing. And that is what the U.S. has been doing for a long time in accordance with the Taiwan Relations Act. And also, it is important to deter China's use of force by operational means. Although the U.S. Policy toward U.S. commitment to Taiwan is always ambiguous because U.S. has the policy of strategic ambiguity. I'm personally pretty sure that the United States will try to enhance its own military presence in Northeast Asia once it is the military contingencies are likely to occur. So therefore, Japan's role is to keep providing dependable stationing and operational environment for U.S. forces in that region, including base protections and force protection, because Japan hosts more than 50,000 U.S. troops on the soil of Japan permanently in accordance with the Japan-U.S. Security Treaty. And in addition, there are about 30,000 U.S. troops on the soil of South Korea. So therefore, a very important thing is to keep U.S. military presence in that region. So that's the most important thing. So, in the next administration of the United States, then the South Korea, Japan, and the United States must have more intensive dialogue on that point, I think.
Taiwan? I think, as was brought out by brought out by my Japanese colleague, I think Taiwan is very sort of important as far as Indo-Pacific area is concerned. But as far as the security dimensions of Taiwan are concerned, I think he is very correctly brought out that there is a contingency plan amongst the different countries like US, Japan, South Korea, even Australia, would be able to help out in case there is a problem in that area. And as I mentioned to you, that there are certain limitations as far as the Indian assistance is concerned, because in the Indo-Pacific range, as I mentioned to you earlier, our Navy, which is a very competent Navy, very battle-hardened Navy, their capacities are from the Indian Ocean itself. So that itself will be able to indirectly help in the case there is a problem. Because as I mentioned to you from the starting at the beginning, that this area is absolutely joined together starting from Indian Ocean, from the east coast of Asia right up to the Pacific. But there would possibly be the divisions of responsibility. Taiwan is a very important place as for a country as far as we are concerned. But to coming to the South China Sea, in case of any strategic problem, would be something which I think would be discussed in case of contingency amongst the Quad countries. And there would be, I think, a division of the labor, a division of the area of responsibilities, etc. But the Indian Navy going to the South China Sea is something. I'm not a naval man, actually. I'm very much a land man, because even if I go across a river in a boat, I get seasick, so I can't talk much about the naval operations. But my colleagues in the Navy tell me that their capacities are much better utilized in the Indian Ocean itself as an aid. But I want to also put across that in this era, as we are seeing it, to say that the confrontation will be confined to certain spots would be a little simplistic. I would like that scenarios to be developed as to how the thing will develop, whether it will only be confined between China and Taiwan and stay that way. I have got my very serious and grave doubts, because as we are seeing, even in the Ukraine conflict, the things start getting incrementally brought up, and we are entering a very dangerous era in which you can't say that the battle will be fought or the war will be fought between two contestants and everybody else will be standing around the ring and cheering. I think that era is gone. So if something like this happens in South China Sea, I won't bet that it will continue to be confined in the South China Sea. So that is what is dangerously happening. And we are getting indications now that the nuclear dimension, which was kept absolutely away, and we thought it will continue to remain as a deterrence and not be used in actual operation, so that era also has seems to be slipping away, because we are getting indications only about 5 days ago when a missile was fired which is capable of nuclear warheads also. Thankfully, it was only used in very conventional weapons. So I'll be very careful when I'm talking about contestations. The contestations between two countries as it used to be, and the war lasted for about 20 days, and then the UN stepped in, and good time was had by all, is an era which is gone, which we used to also think about that war will be 15 days. The reserves required are only 15 days. We see for ourselves that a conflict in the heart of Europe, which was unthinkable after Second World War, has already stretched on to 1,000 days, and there seems to be no end to it. It reminds me of my Hindi movies, my Indian movies, which go on and on and on. So, unlike the Hollywood movies which finish abruptly. So I don't know whether this can be said now that war will be only confined to Taiwan. So I would be very, very careful in not accepting this thing.
May I add one more comment? Okay. From the viewpoint of China, Taiwan is the core of their core interests. And China doesn't abandon the possibility of use of force against Taiwan. And as I said, Taiwan is very important for Japan, particularly geographically. And also, Taiwan is a mature democracy experiencing several times of change of government after democratic elections. And also, Taiwan is very important from the viewpoint of particularly, chip industry. So, and also, Taiwan is very important for our own security, because once Taiwan is taken by China, then it will be much, much easier for the Chinese PLA Navy to advance to the Pacific Ocean, and it will endanger our own security. Not only Japan, but also Australia and the United States as well. So therefore, from my own personal perspective, security of Taiwan is very, very important. Of course, different countries can contribute to the security of Taiwan differently, but at least it is very important to have unanimous voice for the security of Taiwan. So from this point of view, it is very, very unfortunate that no Quad statements so far have not referred to the importance of the peace and stability of Taiwan. And you know why it is so. But anyway, I don't want to accuse any people from India, but it is the fact.
I think that's a great start, great part for me to start from. So I think India will not be directly engaged, and there are a lot of lessons from India's response to the conflict in Europe. But this I think more questions will be asked in a Taiwan contingency simply because it's closer to home in many ways. India also has more influence when it comes to maritime influence in the Indian Ocean region. But I think if you look at what the Indian Navy does now, for example, it does not do joint patrols, even in South China Sea. It does it alone. That indicates that there will not be a direct role in the conflict, so to speak. There will be a diplomatic response, as we had seen in the Russian case also, calling for peace and a conversation and diffusion of the conflict. But I think what will definitely happen is India's traditional role of making sure the SLOCs in the Indian Ocean region remain open for economic reasons will definitely be on India's mind, and that's something it will do. There will also be a lot of quiet cooperation, and that is one of the reasons why I mentioned the importance of MRO agreements between India and the US. So those agreements will still be in play during any future conflict. So US auxiliary ships could still use Indian facilities. They will not, I don't think there will be a stop to that kind of an agreement that is a pre-contingency agreement. So there will be a lot of cooperation kept away from public quietly. But expecting a direct role, I think, does not really make sense.
I'd just like to add, there are no direct or indirect roles of different countries. You see, when there are four partners, the partners decide amongst themselves what role they have to adopt to help each other. So there is nothing confidential about it. The point is the Indian Ocean itself is a very important area. Bulk of the trade and bulk of the energy flows through the Indian Ocean. So as I mentioned, that as my colleague also has mentioned, that there are four countries in dialogue with each other. It is not a security, setup, but there is still a very large security element into it, and people talk to each other. So to think that if a partner is in trouble at a distance place, that they may not, there will be roles which are performed by each partner to enhance each other's capacities. So I will not go more into detail because that goes into the realm of the planning, which I am thankfully retired a long time ago and happily living with that. I am not charged with that responsibility. It's a very difficult talk. But I can tell you that all the four partners of Quad have got very professional members. I think I will not boast about it. The capacities of the military leaders, military component of all the four countries is very efficient. You can take it my word for it. They know their jobs and they keep meeting each other, and they quite a few times meet each other, have a drink with each other, exercise with each other, and they talk to each other. That I think should be sufficient. Okay. That in times of trouble they'll be able to help each other.
Thank you. Okay, unfortunately we already ran out of time, so we have to finish this panel. I would also ask our technical crew that maybe can we start our second panel with a few minutes delay so that people would have enough time for the coffee break? Okay, thank you.
Hello. Welcome to the Danube Institute for the second panel entitled Visions for the Global South, India between the BRICS and the Quad, the ASEAN between the Belt and the Road, the IPEF and India's Act East policy. On the panel are some familiar faces from the first one and some new people. So we have Lieutenant General R.K. Sawhney, Centre Head and Senior Fellow, National Security and Strategic Studies and Internal Security Studies, Vivekananda International Foundation, India. We have Gaurav Saini, Co-Founder, Council for Strategic and Defence Research, India. Huang Thi Ha, Senior Fellow, ISEAS, Yusof Ishak Institute, Singapore, Vietnam. And Thomas Benjamin Daniel, Senior Fellow, Foreign Policy and Security Studies Institute of Strategic and International Studies, Malaysia. I'll be the moderator. Philip Pilkington, I'm a visiting fellow at Danube Institute and also a senior researcher at the Hungarian Institute of International Affairs. I will say I'm not a regional specialist, I'm actually a macroeconomist, but we've been doing a lot of work on BRICS. At the MKE, and since this is a very BRICS team talk, we thought it would be wise to have an economic take. Just before I hand over to the panel, I might just kind of highlight some of the economic changes that have taken place since 2019-2020 with respect to the BRICS, and perhaps this will further some discussion. So the first notable change that's taken place is that BRICS is now larger than the G7 in terms of purchasing power parity GDP. I think it crossed that threshold in 2022. It may have been 2021. Chinese and Indian exports have doubled in that time. That's a lot. Imports have gone up about 20%, so imports from China to India, but the exports from China to India have doubled. So it's a really profound change, and I haven't visited India recently, but I'm sure you can see that on the streets. And the final thing that I just highlight, since it's BRICS themed, but it's not particularly economic, but it's a recent event and probably it'll come up, is the agreement that India and China reached at the Kazan summit to try and temper border disputes, or at least hive them off from economic relationships. I suppose the economic angle there is that separating trade from conflict seems to be a general theme of this BRICS, not alliance, but BRICS grouping. So perhaps we can start with from the right, Huang Thi-ha. Maybe you have some comments, just anything that comes to mind in terms of what I've just said, the fact that the economies have changed so profoundly in the region and what it means. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Philip. And I would like to start my remarks by expressing my sincere thanks to the Danube Institute for having me here at the event. And also, this is the third time that I have been to Budapest, and I never get tired of walking, back and forth the river. It's a very lovely historic city. And I also very much appreciate the Danube Institute when you convene this workshop on the Indo-Pacific, and you feature not only one but two voices from Southeast Asia, me and Thomas. And as I reflect upon the positioning of Southeast Asian countries amidst all of these competing or parallel institutions and initiatives by the great powers and major powers, there is a word that comes to mind that is forum shopping, or the fear of missing out. We call FOMO, the fear of missing out. So we could see that, and the list of acronyms doesn't really end here, like the BRI, China's BRI, or the IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework initiated by the Biden administration, or India's Act East policy. You can also consider adding, as you mentioned, the BRICS or BRICS Plus, or the Quad Plus or Quad Light arrangements that was mentioned, not in name, but actually in the nature of the cooperation in the previous session, and also the various global initiatives by China, and not to mention our indigenous grouping in Southeast Asia, ASEAN, and the various ASEAN-led mechanisms as well. So Southeast Asian countries, to describe it in a broad stroke, actually are dancing on many fronts. You see, all Southeast Asian countries are members, participate in the Belt and Road Initiative, and also are part of what we call the Group of Friends of China's Global Development Initiative. And 4 countries, Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Thailand, are now partners of BRICS, or we call BRIC Plus. At the same time, all Southeast Asian countries, except for the less developed economies of Laos, Myanmar, and Cambodia, are also members of the IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, initiated by the Biden administration. And this framework doesn't offer market access. It's not a traditional free trade agreement. And actually, there is not much to be gained in tangible economic benefits so far, but Southeast Asian countries very much welcome it, because there is an enduring importance that Southeast Asian countries attach to the US, both as the largest export market for Southeast Asian countries and also as the largest source of investment, foreign direct investment. And we also see that Southeast Asian countries, especially the maritime states that are the claimant states in the South China Sea, none of them are members of the Quad, but they benefit very significantly from the various Quad initiatives, the Maritime Domain Awareness Initiative, or as mentioned in the previous session, the health initiatives or supply chain diversification initiative as well from the Quad, either collectively or individually. So just like India, Southeast Asian countries use the term strategic autonomy to justify their multi-alignment with the various global initiatives or institutions initiated or advocated by different powers. And I understand that in Europe, you also from time to time engage the term strategic autonomy to mostly in terms of indicate or a certain foreign policy independence from the US. But I think there are certain markers that make Southeast Asian countries' foreign policy choices quite distinct from European countries. First, there is this called the value-neutral approach. Southeast Asian countries are remarkably agnostic when it comes to the domestic political system or domestic governance of an external power, be it a democracy or an authoritarian country. And also, of course, all Southeast Asian countries, even though some may have democracy, electoral democracy, but they do not really neatly sit in the categories of, democracy or authoritarian. Actually, they populate the whole spectrum in between. So this allows them to engage very practically and comfortably with any major country initiative. And they try to avoid the ideological framings that would bind them to one major power over another. The second element that is quite distinct to Southeast Asian, but also to Asian countries in general, is the state of diversity and diffuse power in Asia or in the Indo-Pacific, because the geography, the vast geography, and also the political landscape of the very different sub-regions or countries in the Indo-Pacific are very much more complex and more fragmented than compared to Europe, which is, I think, more condensed or more compact geographically and also politically. And Southeast Asia is really the microcosm of that diversity. And that diversity is manifested not only in terms of our different economic developments and political systems among Southeast Asian countries, but also in terms of their own historical experiences in engagement with the major powers, also in terms of their different geographic locations, and also the different ethnic and social compositions in each country. And those conditions really shape the different threat perceptions and strategic outlooks of Southeast Asian countries vis-a-vis the major powers. I would give an example of my own country, Vietnam, and maybe with Malaysia, and Thomas could comment further on that. Vietnam is a fellow communist state, an authoritarian state as China, and we share a land border with China. And that really necessitates our leadership to maintain a constructive and stable relationship with China. We cannot afford to, anger China unnecessarily. But at the same time, Vietnam has a very long history of resisting the Chinese expansionism, aggression, annexation, assimilation over centuries, if not millennia. So the Vietnamese national identity has been forged through the prism of trying to maintain independence and vigilance towards China. And there is this kind of prevalent and deep-rooted mistrust towards China, not only at the public but also at the elite level, regardless of the positive rhetoric at the top political leadership. And this distrust is very much, manifested in the current South China Sea disputes with China. And we see that Vietnam has the land border with China, a lot of trade going on between Vietnam and China, but at the same time, China's Belt and Road Initiative is not really felt in Vietnam because we are not really like forthcoming or welcoming to Chinese investment in big ticket projects in Vietnam for security concerns and also public sensitivity. And comparing to Malaysia as a fellow claimant state in the South China Sea, but it doesn't share a land border with China, and it also didn't have such a long history with China as Vietnam has. I think that the distrust towards China is not as prevalent or deep-rooted as in Vietnam. And the Malaysian people, as far as I know, they identify the identity should come first for them from the religion perspective. Are you Muslim or not? Or and ethnicity second, are you Malay or not? And then the third part is nationality. Are you Malaysian or not? And also the Malaysian public and the Malaysian leadership are very much keenly attuned to issues that are related to what we call Muslim solidarity, especially those that concern the plight of the Palestinians in their conflict with Israel. So there is a very strong undercurrent of anti-American in the Malaysian sentiments. So this kind of diversity really incentivizes Southeast Asian countries to adopt a more inclusive approach to order making in the region. And also because of this diversity, no single major power could really mobilize all Southeast Asian countries under its wing. There is always some kind of outlier or divergence and different initiatives or threat perceptions vis-a-vis the different powers. The third element that I would like to mention, and this is quite common among smaller states, but to Southeast Asia, I think is very, very clearly manifested. It is a very prevailing pragmatism in our foreign policy choices. And the bottom line, of course, of our pragmatism is our national interest, as defined by the ruling governments or leadership. And I would like to highlight that central to this pragmatism is the focus on economic development, because economic growth is very, very important to their legitimacy, and also corresponds to our national needs and our national aspirations as well. And as part of this focus on economic development, we really put high priority on, for example, maximizing opportunities for market access, attracting foreign direct investment, or having a seat at any table that discusses economic matters that are pertinent to our economic interests, be it like digital economy or also de-dollarization in the BRICS context. But I also would like to highlight that, being in BRICS Plus or going alongside with the global South rhetoric of demanding for a more just and equitable international system doesn't really mean that we adopt wholesale the Chinese worldview or we align with China against the U.S. In Southeast Asia, I call it forum shopping because Thailand and Indonesia, for example, they applied for membership in BRICS, but at the same time, they also applied for membership in the OECD. And actually, being a member of BRICS doesn't really require much. We are not very clear about the criteria, but being a member of OECD requires government agencies of these countries to do a lot of effort in terms of policy reforms and restructuring to meet all of these criteria. And another example is that we see Vietnam is very much ideologically aligned with China and with Russia. On issues like human rights or democracy, or in the rhetorical demand for a more democratic or equitable international system. But at the same time, Vietnam also embraces the open and free Indo-Pacific construct and engage with the US and other Quad countries on issues that are of its interest, especially in terms of empowerment of its maritime capabilities or promoting the rules-based order in the maritime governance in the South China Sea. And the fourth element that I would like to emphasize when it comes to Southeast Asia and why we have been very open to various initiatives and institutions is because it is based on a kind of inherent mindset of openness and also the reality of the deep connection or integration of Southeast Asian economies to the global market and also to the global flows of investment, of capital and technologies. Currently, I just make a check. ASEAN is the largest trading partner of China, but we are also the second largest trading partner of Japan and South Korea, third largest trading partner of the EU, and the fourth largest trading partner of the US and India. So our economies are very, very open with a very high exposure to international trade and investment. The global North countries, members of the OECD, they account for 36 to 38% of our trade. China, 14 to 20% in the past decade. ASEAN, intra-ASEAN trade, always steady at 20 to 23%, and the rest of the world, 20%. So that shows that Southeast Asian countries do really prosper and thrive based on its connection and interdependence with both the global North and the global South. And it's the North, South, East, West bridging capabilities and positioning of Southeast Asian countries that has underpinned its economic prosperity and also progress and global relevance in the past decades. And I think it will continue to be so in the future. So when we talk about Southeast Asian positioning amid all of this global South rhetoric, discourse, I think it is important to distinguish between rhetoric and reality. Rhetoric is that we have certain common needs, concerns, certain rhetorical solidarity, alignment with global South, for example, from the G77 forum or the UNGA platform, that we would like to have more just and more equitable international system. But at the same time, the reality is that our countries make their foreign policy decisions based on their own national interest rather than based on the general abstract notion of global South solidarity. And also, the economies of Southeast Asian countries are very much globally connected, and we cannot just fall into, the binary of North or South. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Yes, that's what strikes me, isn't it? That's certainly what strikes me as an economist. The amount of trade going on in Asia-Pacific between these countries is absolutely enormous, and I don't think it's fully appreciated sometimes in the West. So maybe, Mr. Saini, you could give us a view from India, perhaps. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Philip. Since I bored you in my last panel, I'm going to keep my comments very brief. And I'm going to pick up from what Huang was saying, the distinction between rhetoric and reality. I think that's a very important distinction. I'm going to try and maybe make that distinction for you when we are talking about this panel. And I think the first reality that we need to keep in mind, I strongly believe, is that most of human behavior, behavioral economics, and by default state behavior, structuralism, can be understood through the normal curve. So there are two extremes, the haves and the have-nots, and there's a large middle. That's the normal curve in the middle, right? So what happens is that when we use a language of between, it is only people or states on the far right side, and I don't mean ideologically, but in terms of the haves, who can make those white and black distinctions and choices. It is also the states on the far left that don't have much, who therefore can make those very clear distinctions while making choices. Most of the middle is the gray. Most of the middle is where the global south lies. And with Obama's pivot to Asia, I think that was very well understood there. So that's one reality. The second reality is the reality of globalization. So it's been 2-3 decades. We have to expect that economies in the global south will grow, will get entangled, and have multiple vectors. They will get one thing from some other country, one thing from another country. And that's what we are seeing. Therefore, it becomes very difficult for them to believe that they are in between anybody. When you trade, you trade. You trade with everybody, right? And what we've seen, therefore, is also challenges to the Washington Consensus, because there's an alternate view of how trade should be done. Initially, it was about tariffs, and now increasingly is about standards, right? So that's another important distinction. That's the second reality. The third reality I want to point out is how ahistorical an argument is about alliances. I think we forget history. We forget that alliances were forged after terrible violence. They were forged in war. That kind of violence we have stopped seeing. Yes, we are seeing a war in Europe and in the Middle East. But the alliances that we take for granted, we think that it came out of nowhere. Two leaders met, shook hands, and a very strong alliance was formed. No, it was formed after defeat, after 2 terrible wars in Europe, right? So therefore, I think this thinking through alliances, this thinking of between, is restricted to a certain history, to a certain region, to a certain economic practice. I think those are the 3 realities that we need to keep in mind. Now, I'm not going to touch upon the ASEAN between BRI and IPEF, because my 2 esteemed colleagues are here. And I think you also raised about the recent diffusion of tensions between India and China. So maybe we can come to that later, after the general has also spoken. But I will perhaps throw a little bit of light on how I make sense of India amongst BRICS and the Quad. So from India's perspective, I think India is, as I said, not in between anyone. India's foreign policy is rooted in non-alignment and anti-alliance stance that comes from a place of civilizational identity, a need to stand by itself on its own 2 legs. At present, we see this as strategic autonomy, and this is not very unique to India, as my colleague mentioned. And therefore, what this means is we fight our own wars and we make our own peace. I think this is very important to understand. India today is more open to issue-based partnerships with those willing to engage it and willing to help it meet its security and economic needs. Its relations with the US, which we discussed in the first panel, with Europe, with the Middle East, its policy impetus in the East, with Korea, with Japan, Australia, Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, are all indications of its preference for multi-alignment. And our foreign minister and prime minister have often mentioned this. So the first principle to keep in mind is the idea of India maximizing its benefits to service its own security and economic reality. In this, India is willing to engage with all for different purposes. The second principle is to keep in mind is India's historical push for anti-imperialism, anti-colonialism, anti-racism, need for an egalitarian world order where equity is central. And this is important from the Global South perspective. These 2 things. The first is multi-alignment. The second is this, pushing back on how we see the world. And when you see the BRICS and the Quad from these 2 perspectives, from these 2 principles, it makes perfect sense to me. For example, the Quad services the first, multi-alignment. We want things to secure ourselves. We want things to grow our economy, to meet our energy needs, to service our population. So we have the Quad. We participate equally in the Quad. When it comes to anti-imperialism, when it comes to asking for a more equitable world order, more equitable financial institutions, more equitable conversation on climate justice, climate change, green transition, we have the BRICS. Because that's the grouping which involves the countries that have historically been on the receiving end. So if you see it through these 2 principles, it makes perfect sense from India's perspective. One is strategic autonomy. The second is our need to push back, to make sure that our policy space, our our space to make decisions in the middle, in the normal curve, increases, and we don't feel restricted. And that is true for any country in the normal distribution in the middle, right? So I think this is important to keep in mind. I will stop here so that my colleagues can also tell you more.
Thank you so much for that. Yes, I think it's really apropos to mention non-alignment. That's a long-standing policy on behalf of India. There was a lot of excitement, I think, last year about India becoming aligned in some way with the West, and it just seemed strange to me given the fact that the non-alignment goes right back to the Cold War. So I think it's worth highlighting that. Thank you very much. Perhaps, Mr. Daniel, you could give us a view from Malaysia. That would be great. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Philip. I would like to start by thanking the organizers for this invitation. It's such a pleasure to be here in Budapest. It's also a pleasure to be here on the same panel with Ha. It's quite odd that after many years in the same line of work, we have to come all the way to Budapest to actually share a panel. Look, I think being subsets of much larger regions, Central European in your, Southeast Asian in mine, I think we all face our own iteration of major power rivalry and how we must adjust and cope. So I cannot imagine that a Southeast Asian perspective is discussed here very often. A Central European perspective is certainly not the most common thing you will hear back in KL or in Southeast Asia. So I really look forward to learning a lot from you in the discussions that follow. Based on the broader theme of this session, what I thought I will do is I wanted to share my perspectives, at least my take on a Southeast Asian or an ASEAN context. And this is not the same thing. Southeast Asia and ASEAN can actually be extremely different. And I do this with the caveat that the Southeast Asian perspective is diverse and it is very contradictory at many points. Happy to go into more specifics about Malaysia, including some that Ha brought up if there are any questions. So 4 points, I'll try to get them done in 10 minutes. Philip, if I go on, just stop me. The first point about trying to understand how Southeast Asia look at these initiatives, whether it's BRICS, whether it's Quad, whether it's IPEF or Act East or China. Well, China doesn't really call it the BRI anymore. They now have a range of new global initiatives, right? A global civilizational initiative, global security, and I think global economic initiative or something like that. So these are the three new narratives that are coming out of China. But Southeast Asia has, we have often prioritized development or development for security, or rather we see regional security coming from economic development. Now I think it was Charles Fisher who wrote in the 60s that Southeast Asia is the Balkans of the Orient, and he was looking at how diverse this region is in terms of geographic entity, in terms of ethnicity, religion, systems, languages, and then in the 70s and 80s, this really became political, and you saw these frictions playing out at a national level, at a regional level. And it was these frictions that resulted in an organization called ASEAN. ASEAN, very much like what you said, was born out of a conflict between Southeast Asian member states. Now, as ASEAN consolidated, as it grew in the 70s and 80s and 90s and 2000s and so on, development became a central pillar of the regional organization. We now have an ASEAN community that is about to be 10 years old next year, but the root of that community was actually the economic community that started taking place years before 2015. So for policymakers in Southeast Asia with differing political and social systems, all of us have our disputes with each other. Development became a pathway for regional security. It became something we could use to minimize regional tensions and achieve security. There was a phrase that was quite popular in the 90s and 2000s called prosper thy neighbor, which was adopted directly or indirectly by many ASEAN member states. For example, Malaysia and Thailand have a dispute over the Gulf of Thailand. Now we are still having that dispute, but we have a joint agreement to jointly exploit resources in the area which is under dispute. Similarly, I think Cambodia and Vietnam have a similar agreement signed in '82 over disputed waters that cover joint patrols, fishing, and exploitation of resources. Now, when you expand that to the broader Asia Pacific, you get the emerging initiatives like the BRI, IPEF, Act East, etc. It's only natural for countries in Southeast Asia that has long had this development equals security mindset, and we would react positively to all of them. And Southeast Asia is also a region that is greatly in need of economic infrastructure, and anyone that can offer that in the most competitive terms would gain an advantage. Now, previously, this was Japan. Previously, this was assorted European countries and even the US in certain niche areas. Now, more often than not, that means China. But that does not only mean China, that also means South Korea, which are making their presence felt in real ways. Now, ideally, Southeast Asia would like to have this model of development security continue. The question is, can it, especially because there are significant internal and external pressure points. This leads me to my second point, which is on ASEAN regional mechanisms and the pressure that they face. Now, ASEAN has been described as a normative institution which attempts to shape regional norms through its mechanism, the ASEAN Regional Forum, ASEAN +3, East Asia Summit, and these have often been premised on something called ASEAN centrality, or ASEAN at the center, or ASEAN at the driving seat, and has also very strongly emphasized inclusivity. For example, the ASEAN Regional Forum was one of the very few mechanisms, and still is one of the very few regional mechanisms to involve North Korea, although they don't show up anymore. Meanwhile, the East Asia Summit is probably the most inclusive, multilateral, leaders-led summit in the Asia Pacific that addresses strategic political security issues. Yet, these mechanisms are under significant pressure. A lot of them are considered broken. I won't go into why. We can get into that if there is interest. So you get emerging minilaterals, like the Quad, or maybe Squad. You get AUKUS. And all of these are made up by ASEAN dialogue partners who see the significant limitations with ASEAN mechanisms and are reacting based on their own interests. This has created a sense of unease, a sense of fear in Southeast Asia, in ASEAN member states, that its mechanisms are being sidelined, that its centrality is being eclipsed, and you do see a backlash against such mechanisms by assorted entities in some member countries. You see that as in part of the academia, part of the think tank scope. Some governments can still be particularly jumpy about these things. But again, feedback is diverse. And I guess, while there is some concern, I think ASEAN also has to be honest with itself. It needs to have a serious introspection on whether it is managing the issues as best as it can, and why do dialogue partners feel the need to move on with other mechanisms, not necessarily sidelining ASEAN, but a parallel mechanism to move ahead. The third point is that major power rivalry has pushed Southeast Asian states to diversify our partners, but also get close to allies. So Ha mentioned, you see countries like Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand that engage with Chinese-led initiatives, that engage with BRICS, but at the same time are also part of IPEF, that also seek closer economic engagements with Europe and the United States. However, you do see some countries in Southeast Asia, Cambodia, Myanmar, the Philippines, for unique reasons of their own, drawing closer to either China or the United States. And these are very specific reasons. I think Ha put it really nicely. Southeast Asian states can dance on many fronts. My terminology is much less sophisticated. I always say that Southeast Asia is a very promiscuous place, and we apply this in how we engage with countries or external partners as well. Many of us diversify to avoid overdependence, right? Now, for a country like Malaysia, diversification is not really about picking a side. It's not really about making a political point, but it's about preparing for what we think will be a more multipolar, a more protectionist world. And I think this is very much similar for most ASEAN member states. Diversification is seen as a way to maintain strategic autonomy, a way for all of us to hedge. So on that score, you will see general interest by ASEAN member states in all these initiatives, even if it doesn't yield any immediate benefits. And what comes to mind here is IPEF. What Southeast Asian countries really want when it comes to engagement with the US is greater market access. But we will not get that. No one will get that. The domestic political environment in the States will not allow for that for the foreseeable future. Yet when the Americans proposed IPEF, broad nebulous concept that is only now starting to take shape several years after it was proposed, all the 7 Southeast Asian countries that were approached all signed up immediately. And I think that shows, at least at a political level, a desire to signal to the Americans that, hey, if you guys are making an effort, even though it doesn't really match what we want, at least you're making an effort, and it will be received accordingly in the region. My last point. I framed this as a conclusion, but then it became really unwieldy, so I'll just turn it into sort of a final point. Look, I think Southeast Asia faces extremely challenging but also very interesting points. There are multiple initiatives by regional and global powers, a lot of it centered around Southeast Asia. It is easy, when you are in Southeast Asia, it's extremely easy to talk about the challenges to ASEAN, to talk about all this doom and gloom stuff for the regional organization, but there is a flip side to the coin. And it's a conversation on whether Southeast Asian countries, whether this regional organization, ASEAN, can leverage on them and to turn them into opportunities. Now, many ASEAN officials or Southeast Asian officials often talk about this, and with good cause, right? Because this is something that Southeast Asian countries did in the 90s and 2000s. We managed to successfully leverage on our regional position, economic growth, and cohesion as a political entity to draw in major regional and global powers. And it resulted in a lot of tangible benefits. And again, taken as a whole, Southeast Asia is no less a compelling place today than it was in the 90s. Over the last 2 years, from 2021, foreign investments averaged about $220 billion US a year, solidifying our status as the top FDI recipient among developing economies for the last 3 years. 17% of global FDI, flew into this region over the last few years. It is a region of 670 million, mainly young, mainly increasingly educated, mainly very aspiring middle-class people with spending power, which currently mean that it is the third largest economy in Asia and the fifth largest economy behind only the US, China, Japan, and Germany, taken as a whole. I think what's missing, really, is the question of cohesion. We talk endlessly about centrality, about putting ASEAN front and center, but we don't really talk about whether internally, whether we are united or cohesive enough to do this. And I think that's a very difficult decision, very difficult discussion to have. It's a very diverse region, as Ha mentioned. But I think it's only through a more cohesive Southeast Asia that we stand a better chance to not just withstand the potential challenges of uncertainty and rivalry, but turn it into opportunity. I think a more cohesive ASEAN will not just preserve the centrality of my region, but will probably, again, re-attract positive engagement of dialogue partners and even new partners, maybe even from Central Europe. And that will help us stymie the worst instincts of both the Americans and the Chinese when it comes to rivalry of their own. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think your comment about US market access should really be underlined for a Western audience, and it speaks to something that Huang said as well, that the IPEF had no tangibles in it. I think a big problem that the incoming Trump administration is going to find if it tries to engage in economic bloc formation is that they're not putting anything on the table. And as you say, it's for domestic political reasons. The US does want to become more protectionist and so on. well, if you're going out and trying to convince people to do business exclusively with you, and then you're becoming more protectionist, you can't have the cat and the dog, right? You have to choose one. So I think that's something that Westerners haven't actually thought about very much. The American strategists, I don't think, have thought about it either. So it's great to see that it's come up twice. Well, India get 2 votes on the current panel. So General Soni, we'd love to hear your thoughts.
Well, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, I am a soldier, quite away from the economics. I joined the army when I was all of 16 years old, and I retired at 60. So 44 years in uniform. I'm more inclined towards security and slightly less towards the economics. But I want to go slightly away from the script and tell you the deep connection between economy and security. You see, long time ago, I would say in 89, probably I was detailed for a course in England. And that particular time, China was nowhere. Actually, at that particular time, the China was given an access, after 90 was given an access into the economic sort of affairs of the world. And in last about 30 years, look where they have become. I attended a war game in which the Americans opined that as China becomes more prosperous, it will become more democratic, and soon it will start having the type of elections we have in the democracy, and it will become like one of the boys. It didn't happen. You see, from where they were at the bottom of the heap, they have climbed up to being the second powerful power as far as economy is concerned. And the security has come along with it. So it is a country which was nowhere, has been lifted by the system by which the West swears by. Because when you open your economies, you allow a country to become richer over a period of time, and they developed the type of formidable machine as far as manufacturing is concerned, and ultimately reached a stage where they actually have make those industries even in America as junkyards. So that is the power of economy. That is the power which fuels a country into becoming a formidable military force that it has become. So now, I also remember at the time when I got my commission as a second lieutenant in the Indian Army, when I was in 1962, as to what happened with us when we were invaded by China. I was a young officer, and by the time my battalion reached the place where the confrontation had taken place, we had suffered a humiliating defeat in the northeast. And I still remember that when I joined my battalion, I took a vow at that time that this will not happen. It's not me, I was too insignificant. But the country took a vow that they will not allow this to happen again. So subsequently, when I took over the Corps as a 3-star general in the same area, so we decided that we will do whatever it is to make sure that this doesn't happen to us again. And I'm going to tell you one thing, that despite whatever happened in 1920, it is not going to happen once again. We're going to deter them because we have, in a course of time, developed economic capacities, which of course are in the making. So why I brought out this particular point, that there is a deep connection between economy and the security. But another thing I want to tell you is this, that more economic power doesn't make you more democratic. Democracy are the type of governance you want to, inherit for yourself. It depends on you. So India is essentially a democratic country. Irrespective of the allegations sometimes which come about from the West or the America, we are very staunchly democratic. And that, if you can come sometime to India and you can see the way we develop, the way our democracy, noisy democracy, a very, very sort of a acrimonious sort of a democracy,
the debates which take place, I think, like America, we have very, very sort of strong debates, everybody heaping all sorts of things at each other, but it is a democracy nevertheless. So similar impulses also impel the forces as was brought out in Asia, that every country here wants to develop economically, but also to keep its options open. Because should you divide yourself into the different alliances as far as the economy is concerned, you restrain or you restrict your advancement. You can't say tomorrow that I am friendly or I am very much close to, for example, West. I'll only trade with West. Just can't happen. Or you can say that I am authoritarian regime and I'll only operate and trade with the countries which are also inclined in that direction. Then it doesn't happen. Economy is very secular. Economy means trade across the barriers. But trading with each other doesn't mean that you are accepting other countries' dominance over you. For example, I'll tell you today, as of today, we have a large import from China. Actually, they are the second largest partner as far as our external sort of our exports, our imports are concerned. But that doesn't mean that we are close to them so far as our strategy is concerned. So that's what I think my colleague very wonderfully brought out, my colleague from Vietnam. She brought out beautifully well that they also, as far as their strategy is concerned, it is their thinking is concerned, some of the thinking is akin to China. But to say that they are part of the Chinese, Chinese sphere of influence will be insulting the gallant Vietnamese. Actually, they have their differences with them as far as their strategy is concerned, but they have got a congruence with them as far as the economy is concerned. This is what is happening also in the other ASEAN countries. So this is something which we require to respect. But it is something which we have to continue to keep thinking about. So similarly, as far as India is concerned, we decided at a certain time that we shall continue to grow economically. We'll strive to grow economically. So that is the reason why we are having our economic relationships across the board in all the domains. Because that is where there will be a rise of India to an extent, to a state where we cannot be threatened. And ladies and gentlemen, we live in a very difficult neighborhood. We have got Pakistan on our west, which has been waging a proxy war on us since independence in 1947. We have to counter them. And they are also a nuclear-enabled power. But more than Pakistan, we have China, actually. Starting off, they have a presence over our northern borders, and there is a nexus between China and Pakistan. So to counter that, we have to make sure that not only do we develop in a, military fashion, but also economically. So those are the compulsions which drive us, and that is how we are working in a way that we develop our economy, we develop our trade, and we also want to be in a certain area where we cannot be bullied by anybody, where we develop our own self-sufficiency. And that's why whenever we trade or whenever we have economic relationship with the Western countries or America, we want to be self-sufficient. And I think America has very, very correctly analyzed that to make India self-sufficient economically will be benefiting not only the region, but globally also, because India will always be a counter to any regime, authoritarian regime, like China, who try to overpower the countries around them. So it's a relationship which is developed on a mutual respect. But we also, on the other hand, have a relationship with Russia. But in any case, that doesn't stop us to have a relationship with the West. With the West and America, there is a relationship because of the democratic compulsions that we have got. We and America have both got very noisy democracies. Democracies where every fourth or fifth year, a leader has to prove himself to the population. And the population, if you come to India sometime and see our elections, it is absolutely chaotic. I mean, you see our debates on the TV, you will think that both sides will punch each other or pounce on each other. That's what happens in America also. That is what is the beauty of democracy. So we are very fiercely democratic, but we are very fiercely also proud of ourselves. But that doesn't mean that we also are very clear that we have to cooperate with each other. So for us, ASEAN countries, our fellow Asian countries are extremely important because we feel that this is going to be a century of Asia. We have to cooperate with each other. We have to trade with each other. We have to make each other self-sufficient so that no country is able to overwhelm us. No country is able to dominate us. So that is actually, these are the impulses which make us work. It is not only in, and we absolutely respect the centrality of ASEAN. We understand why they are doing what they are doing. So there is also a trade, and I have been to the ASEAN countries. I think they all are developing in a way. At one particular time, long time ago, we were offered the membership of ASEAN. I think the leadership at that time was less than wise to have declined it, because probably that would have been a good thing. But now at the moment when the various sort of trade agreements are going on, we are trying to be part of them as much as possible. But there is also a problem as far as India is concerned. The India also requires to find employment, and it requires to generate the type of progress within ourselves so that our industry reaches a certain level. We have managed to get our IT people at a certain level. Actually, our export, as far as IT is concerned, it has become a formidable power. Our people in Bangalore, if you come sometime, most of the top global companies, US companies, their backyard work is done in Bangalore. But we want to actually, instead of doing only the backyard one, what do you call work, we want to do something more original, which we are trying to do. So basically, I'm trying to put across to you as far as India is concerned. And here I'd like to also mention that as far as we are concerned, we like to also take along the global south with us. That organizations like BRICS, etc., SCO, etc., are there. They may have been formed for certain reasons, but India makes sure that none of these organizations are anti-West, because we have a very strong relation with the West. So you also have now a very strange spectacle of the BRICS not having about 10 to 12 members, but about 20 to 30 members waiting in the sidelines. Probably the reason, as I brought out in the first panel, is that these countries want to find their voice. And as I mentioned, the UN actually has ceased to remain a place where they could find their voice. So it's a very sort of a paradoxical thing that an organization which was formed after the Second World War to look after the interests of the whole world has at the moment failed to perform the duty it was formed for. So these organizations are trying to come and fill in that gap. How far they succeeds, I don't really know. How they develop, I'm really not sure. But I can only tell you one thing, that more organization takes place, the more voices are heard. I think probably it is not bad for the world. I'll also like to talk about IMEC, which has been talked about, which we have done in the G20 when we had the presidency last year. There is a relationship between India, Saudi Arab, America, and Israel, and it's a type of arrangement which at the moment there is a pause because of the problem which are happening in the West Asia, but hopefully if the problems get settled, this will take place. This is one of the organizations which we have invested in, with the future organization which we think will have a future as far as the economic relationship is concerned. But once again, I wanted to bring about that economic relationships and security relationships have a relation, but they don't overpower each other. So that is my strong point to you, that it is very important that we understand that economic interaction, the trade agreements with each other, despite having the differences, despite having strategic differences, can take place, as it is happening today in the world. It's a very complicated world. The situation is not easy. It cannot be, oversimplified, but it is something which we have to take it. How the world goes forward, I really don't know, because I think your generation will know more, quite a young people here. But my generation, the old generation, actually has failed. It has failed to look after the interests of the countries who are at the bottom of the heap. It has failed to make sure that the people in the Asia or in the ASEAN found their voice, or they failed to see that the trade agreements and the commerce with each other went to the, state where everybody could benefit. So these various organizations which are coming up are more of a reaction. But thank you so much. I hope I have not complicated the issue with that.
Thank you, General Soni. Yeah, I agree. I think there's a lot of misconceptions about the nature of military or geopolitical conflict and the economy. I mean, just look at the moment of the extensive trade going on in energy between Turkey and Israel at the same time as the countries are effectively at each other's throats. This is quite typical. It's actually very unusual. It's more so unusual for countries in geopolitical and military conflict to cut off these trade relations. It does happen, but it's unusual. I suppose that brings me to two things that I'd like to raise, not to anybody in particular. Feel free to take turns, but look, the BRICS concept has been around for a while. It came out of a Goldman Sachs report, I believe, which has been used to kind of malign the concept. And it kind of developed and took on a life of its own. But I think people weren't paying that much attention to it until 2 years ago, I think it's fair to say. And it started getting a lot more attention. At first, people, I think, tried to ignore it for about a year. And then they ceased. So on my reading, having actually done some quite extensive work on this, on my reading, and please correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm here to learn as much as anybody else, there's two drivers behind the BRICS in a sense. We might think of them as long-term and short-term. Economists love doing this, logic chopping. And in the long term, I think it's dissatisfaction with international economic institutions. General Soni and I discussed this before the panel. The Bretton Woods institutions in particular, the IMF and the World Bank, I think that there's been discontent with them for a very long time in the global south. And I think the way that the BRICS has developed, if you see the BRICS Bank in Shanghai and so on, it's not rivaling the World Bank at the moment, no one's making that claim, but it's a replica institution. So it's very clear to me that was the long-term driver of discontent. The short-term driver, and the thing that's given it a lot of impetus in the past 2 years, has been the sanctions policies, of course. Now, the sanctions policies after the Russian invasion of Ukraine are not, they're not unique. There's sanctions on Iran, there's sanctions on Cuba, there's sanctions on North Korea, and so on. But I think these were of a different order of magnitude. We don't have to get into why that is and so on. They also undertook some slightly unusual things like freezing of the reserve assets and so on. But I just would love to get the perspectives from various countries on these two issues. Speak to one of them if you want, speak to both of them if you want. I don't mind. But you know, long-term drivers of discontent that have led to an attempt to create alternative framework, which is long-standing, and the more short-term issue of sanctions, especially in the wake of the Russia-Ukraine war. If anyone would like to go first, just jump in.
don't be too chaotic, but would perhaps.
Thanks, Philip. I think the distinction is quite nice, at least to think about and help organize our response. I think the long-term drivers, as you mentioned, against a perception of inequality, I think they are here to stay, and that's what we've seen. But I think where the problem lies, or where things get a little muddier, is the starting point of the conversation, where you said 2 years ago, suddenly people woke up to the reality of the BRICS. And the reason for that is the war in Europe. Exactly. So you are seeing that until that point, an organization that was perhaps seen as a club of developing economies suddenly has political meaning. It has a meaning that can virtue signal, can stand up as an alternate pole and say that, provide an alternate to somebody that the West is trying to punish, which is Russia, right? So I think that is precisely why 2 years ago suddenly BRICS becomes important. But this is closely connected to your second part, which is short term. And I think from India's perspective, India has never believed that unilateral sanctions work. And there are reasons for it. There are exigencies wherein you need to service your own needs, whether it's a massive population that may be undernourished. And that's not very unique to India. It's also a lot of other economies in the global south. So on both those counts, a membership of the BRICS therefore makes so much more sense. But I do believe that there is a little unhappiness about the manner in which the BRICS perhaps taken this flavor. And when I say unhappiness, that's from India's perspective. Because if you go back to what I said, we do not like this kind of alliance formation. So if you give a political flavor to an economic organization, that is not something that India prefers. So there is a contestation there. Second, there are conversations around de-dollarization, and there are lots of papers that I think we've all sort of looked at. There again, a conversation on de-dollarization on one end, while is quite evocative in India, but at the same time, the alternate to that is something that is unilaterally led by China. So what we are seeing in the end is countries deciding to do bilateral trade in their own currencies. Right? We've seen that happen during the war between India and Russia as well, to a certain point, but it has its cap. We have to keep that in mind. So I think a lot of this angst or worry around what shape and form the BRICS will take is just because of the present moment. If the war ends tomorrow, I think we might go back to people ignoring the BRICS.
I may not talk about the BRICS, the members themselves, their perspectives, but more from the Southeast Asian perspective, especially the 4 Southeast Asian countries that are now partners of BRICS under the so-called BRICS Plus. And recently, our institute organized a webinar, a seminar on the motivations and perspectives of these countries when they applied for BRICS membership. And I must differentiate. Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand applied for membership. Vietnam didn't. But Vietnam engages with BRICS under different mechanisms, and they don't mind being a partner country, but not a member country. So throughout the seminar itself, a clear takeaway is that the drivers for Southeast Asian countries to apply for BRICS do not always have to be based on a very well-informed interagency, thorough, comprehensive cost-benefit analysis. These decisions, for example, by new Indonesian President Prabowo, are very much driven at the top leadership level. And he and other leaders in Thailand and Malaysia, you may add on, they do have their political incentives For example, for the new Thai government, they wanted to have a quick wins, being in a big group with all of these big powers, and then they think that they can, amplify their global standing, at least in the eyes of the Thai people. Or Prime Minister Anwar, he wants to project himself as a global South leader. And because of his very strong position against the West or against the US on the issue of Palestine and Israel, he thinks that BRICS would, project him as a kind of an outlier, actually. So it's and that is one thing. The second thing is we can see like diversification is actually the innate driver of all countries in this increasingly contested and uncertain world. And as the general just mentioned, the more platforms, then the more voices, the more chances for our voices to be heard. So it is quite an abstract expectation to have a seat at the table. And from the optics point of view, for a leader of Vietnam or Indonesia or Thailand or Malaysia to be at the same table with all of these big countries is something that they can sell domestically as well. And of course, there are certain tangible expectations, for example, market access or anything, but actually that expectations are not very high because like countries like Vietnam, they already have good relationships, economic relationships with all of these countries, and for market access, Southeast Asian countries already have it with China through, for example, or with India through ASEAN, India, ASEAN, China free trade agreement, or from the RCEP already. So I would like to mention that it's not really a very clear cost-benefit analysis based on, full inputs from the government agencies or stakeholders, but very much politically driven at the top leadership level.
I will agree with everything Ha said. A lot of this is driven from the top, and whatever misgivings the system might have, the system gets in line behind apex policymakers, after they've made an announcement. I think I quite enjoyed your long-term, short-term view on BRICS. I think, at least within Malaysia, there is a constant narrative of dissatisfaction with existing Western European, North American-dominated trade systems, monetary fiscal systems. But we often complain about that, yet we are very much a part of those systems, and we also benefit tremendously from them. So it's always been a case of us trying to have our cake and eat it, and sometimes succeeding. I guess during the break, we had a conversation over here where I made an observation of BRICS seemingly united by a set of grievances, but I struggle to find what the long-term objective or the sort of clear long-term objective and goal is. Everyone agrees about all the things that annoy them, yet they might have a more difficult time agreeing in what they actually want to get out of it, what they want to achieve. Conversations about de-dollarization has been going on for the last 10 years, and we're nowhere closer to that than when we began. I would be particularly interested to actually, if I do get the chance to actually quiz the original 5 members of BRICS. We have India here, and we've heard some of this. Was this the intent when it came to expansion? You think about expansion, you make an offer to some countries, and suddenly you have loads more lining up at the door to get in. What is the game plan here? What is the ultimate outcome? Is this what you thought it was going to be? And how ready are you for this kind of expansion? And where is the mismatch between what the original member countries intended and what these new applicants think they're going to get out of it? Well, no, it's not a specific question to either of you. It's me just thinking out loud.
I'm interested in the answer.
The point you brought out was that what were the intentions of the original, actually 4 and the 5th South Africa joined it. What are the intentions in this present setup? I really don't know. You see, the point is that I think, first of all, it is beyond my pay level. But I want to tell you that the organizations, when they evolve for a different purpose. And ultimately, when they expand, they become something else. But the point is that when it was formed, the impulses were entirely different, as I can mention. But today, the impulses are completely different. And to say that it is going to be anti-West or anti-US, when we have people like India, when you have people like Saudi Arab and hordes of other people, I think that will be undermining the thinking of these important countries. So you see, basically, you look at what the UN was when it was conceived and what it has become today. Actually, if you seriously ask me, if you want to dilute the impulses of about 4 people, make them join with a crowd of 20. So the point is ultimately, it's a very strange affair that when you have a group of 3 people, the impulses are very strong. The ideas are very firm. But if you have a crowd of about 25 or 30, they get diluted. Some people who started with a certain mindset suddenly talk in a different tones altogether. So they become actually more rational. They become more pragmatic. So that is what has happened. And as you mentioned, not only 20, I had happened to talk with one of the very senior bureaucrats from the Ministry of External Affairs. There are at least about 50 people in the lineup. There are various theories why it expanded. I will not go into this because I don't have any time for these theories which are manufactured by slightly jobless international affairs people. So I am a soldier, I don't know. But I only understand that this organization is not a military organization. Everybody can't be ordered to turn right and they'll turn right, left, or they'll turn. They are all democratic people. If you tell them to turn right, most of them will turn left. So I really don't know. But it is an organization which requires to be watched because it is a cry of the people who didn't have a voice to be heard, as my colleague from Vietnam and Malaysia told you. The leaders who are there, they want to be seen. They don't want to remain a mob. So an organization where they can talk, where their photographs can be, printed on the front page of their newspapers, I think that's what it is. Sorry, I'm being oversimplistic, but that is the problem of being a soldier.
I'll just give a 1-second add-on, right? And for countries or organizations that are concerned about BRICS and its expansion, the answer here is not really containment. The answer here is offer alternatives, engage more. And you will find a lot of these countries that are very promiscuous by nature will react to options when they are made available.
Well, I think there is the trade-off between size and coherence in any institutional organization. And in ASEAN, we have a very big cautionary tale. It is called the ASEAN Regional Forum, which was established in 1994, right after the Cold War of ASEAN and its 10 dialogue partners. And over time, it increased to include Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, North Korea, 27 countries now, and it is technically dysfunctional now, especially in this age of great power rivalry, and we cannot agree on anything. So I think BRICS. I'm not a BRICS. I don't look at BRICS very closely, but I think increasingly, China and Russia have been trying to turn BRICS into an anti-West vehicle for their geopolitical agenda. And they seem to gain a lot of traction. They use the kind of BRICS expansion to support the propaganda that they are winning the game. But I think the more they do it, the more pessimistic I will be about the BRICS potential in the future. Because if you don't deliver to your expanded membership, then basically it's just a gathering of leaders of very different backgrounds and different strategic outlooks. And we have India there, as you mentioned, Saudi Arabia, Brazil. They don't agree with so many things that China and Russia are proposing. And I said, trade-off between size and coherence. So it's good that Quad doesn't expand at this time.
Yeah, just wanted to add a couple of points in this. I think one is obviously, as we were discussing in the morning as well, it seems like it's the age of minilateralism. So if something is expanding, then it comes at a cost of, I guess, functionality and purpose. The second is, I think there could be some lessons from as the general said, what is the original idea and how does it evolve and adapt to a certain context. So if you look at the SCO, it starts as a Shanghai 5, China's need to settle its borders in Central Asia, then expands and other people come in, Russia, and at some point, 2017, I believe, India and Pakistan as well. And then after that, 3 more countries, including, I think, Iran. But where does the SCO stand today? We had a summit very recently. There are multiple mechanisms. There's something that works in Central Asia on terrorism. But there are other things that have not been sorted out. And if you see that when a country starts observing that its interests are not being met in a certain organization, whether regional or international, it starts reaching out directly. So now India has a direct forum called the India Central Asia Forum. I think 2 of them have been hosted and another one is going to be hosted. So the lessons there are also important. How did an organization begin? What happened to it after it expanded? What happens to it when one of the countries wants to be overbearing, wants to set the tone, wants to use it for a certain purpose? I think there's a lot of agency in the Global South. And that agency is then expressed. And unfortunately, it has implications for that organization.
Okay, well, the currency that moderators trade in is time, and I'm trying to reclaim some of that time for the organisers because the first panel ran late. So I'm afraid no questions because we're already over, but I thought that was really interesting and I learned a lot, so perhaps we can thank our speakers for such a fantastic panel. Thank you, everybody.